Thanks for being here today. Thanks, Ayan, for the introduction. I am a researcher, like Ayan said, here at PRIO, as well as University College London. And the title of the presentation today is Legacies of Racial Violence, Mapping the Past to Understand the Present. So the panel will focus on the legacies of racial violence and committed against African Americans in the United States. So understanding how violence committed over a century, over 200 years, has impacted and shaped the United States society and policy. The legacies aren't part of the distant past. They continue to influence institutions, education, political trust, as well as how citizens relate to the state. And our panel today will discuss some of these questions. We're very thankful to have a diverse perspective to bear on these questions. We have with us Tuva Biergas. Hopefully I said that okay. And she brings a unique perspective, contemporary as well as journalistic, from her many years as a U.S. correspondent, as well as Bruce Barnhart, who offers a lens of history and literature to understand how political violence and identity are imagined and remembered. So my role is in this opening stage, is to provide to trace the historical context of racial violence, as well as to discuss some of the challenges in addressing the methodological issues for these research questions. And then moving on to discuss some of our key findings using the case of racial violence in 1919 and how it impacted educational attainment. So let's start with the past, because we have to, in order to understand racial violence, we have to understand it as part of a continuum. And I think this graph right here illustrates that pretty well. It has different eras of the U.S., but the one graph shows that about 1/3 of the U.S. population in 2018 lived during Jim Crow. So I think it just drives home the point that the past is not dead; it's not even past. Okay, so when we think about racial violence in the United States, we often think about slavery, or organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, which we should. But to really understand racial violence, we need to understand that it's part of a continuum that evolves with the social and political environment. To start with, slavery was a racialized economic order that tied black labor to white wealth. After the Civil War and when it was abolished in 1865, we move into Reconstruction, where the U.S. government tried to make somewhat of amends for the legacy of slavery by implementing economic and political policy reform. This was met with extreme backlash in the form of political terror and political suppression. In one case, in the presidential election of 1865, a white mob attacked a group of African Americans and killed about 150 as they attempted to exercise their political rights. After it ended in 1877, after Reconstruction ended, it moved into the Jim Crow era. So this was an attempt to reestablish white supremacy through policy like segregation, like disenfranchisement, but also through extreme forms of violence, like lynchings was one of the most prominent forms of violence during this time. So over 4,000 documented cases. In addition, we have large waves of anti-Black violence in U.S. cities. One of the more prominent cases is that of the Red Summer in 1919, which we'll discuss a little bit in the next slide. And moving into mid-20th century, which so it can be termed institutionalized violence, so mass incarceration, police violence, and I think this map here. This map is a part of another part of the project led by Professor Christian Davenport, and it's the Anti-Black Human Rights Violations Index that stretches from 1850 to 2000, and its attempt to quantify in the sense how bad certain counties are. So going from not so bad to really, really bad. And one thing to note is that it's not just limited to the South, which is often what we think of when we think of racial violence, but it's across all of the United States. Okay, so I'll speak a little bit about the Red Summer, move on to some of the challenges in studying this question, the question I pose here, and then some of the key findings. All right, so the Red Summer was part of this large anti-Black wave that occurred, anti-Black collective violence that occurred in 1919. It was certainly the most intense form of collective violence since Reconstruction. About 20 states were affected, including some of the largest, like Chicago, like Washington, D.C., and other mid-sized cities, Omaha, Nebraska, and small towns like Bisbee, Arizona. So it's often cited that some of the causes of this were Black veterans returning home from World War I. I know they fought to make the world safe for democracy. They sought to do the same when they returned, so they would not turn the other cheek when challenged with white supremacy. The other is the Great Migration, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in the next slide. And this caused a great demographic shift in cities. And lastly, labor competition. So as white soldiers went to go fight in World War I, many companies went to the South and recruited and incentivized Black men to fill their positions. And some of the violence during this time it was characterized by the looting of homes, the burning of businesses, forcing Black residents from so-called white neighborhoods, as well as indiscriminate forms of violence. So this motivates the question of, did exposure to Red Summer during childhood influence their educational attainment as adults? And it's a very significant question. We know educational attainment is tied to political participation. We know it's linked to socioeconomic status. So some of the challenges in not only to address this question, but in general, studying racial violence in the United States. One of the greatest challenges is that of the Great Migration, in which about 6 million African Americans left the South during 1910, from 1910 to 1970. To put that in perspective, before 1910, about 90% of the Black Americans lived in the South before 1910. After, in 1970, less than half did. At the same time, we have about 5 million white Southerners also leaving the South. So this begs the question of, where does the legacy live? Does it live in the place in which it occurred, or does it live in those individuals who carry the memory of that experience? When you talk about this dispersion of those who are most affected by violence during this era. Another is data fragmentation. Boundaries oftentimes change in the U.S. counties. So some of the local geographic administrative unit are often changing. What's considered a county in 1 year is maybe not doesn't exist the next year, or is two, or is got enlarged. So you need to sort of harmonize these different boundaries and make sure that when you speak about a city or a county in 1 year, the next census year, they're the same thing. And lastly is this causal complexity. So how do we distinguish the effect of the Red Summer or any form of racial violence in the broader, compared to broader social forces like Jim Crow, like segregation, like redlining? We address that by using historical racial violence documents, as well as, and linking that to and combining that with census data. So this linked census data, as well as geocoding standardized places. And I'll speak a little about that here. So the first two we don't directly address in this paper, but something to consider. Incomplete historical record. Even in 1919, we're not exactly sure how many cities experienced anti-Black collective violence. There are multiple forms of racial violence. In part, we decided to focus 1919 because it was mostly urban areas that experienced it, so you didn't have the influence of potentially the other more prominent form of racial violence, that of lynching. And the last 2 points we directly addressed in this paper: some migration patterns that blur geographic legacies and the need for spatial alignment between panel years. All right, so what we do is we use this full count census data between 1870 and 1940. And it's this linked census data, and we're able to trace individuals across different years. So the U.S. Census Bureau has undertaken this really ambitious project of releasing all microcensus data between 1870 and 1940. So information on education, where they resided, employment, demographic information. And for a subset of that, we're able to link individuals across different years. So in that sense, we create this longitudinal data set. We then geocode individuals to standard places. So this is part of another scholarly project that makes sure that ensures that the place is similar across all different years. So when we talk about Chicago in one year, that's Chicago throughout all these years. So this ensures that our study is limited to those exposed to violence or those not exposed to violence in the control group and did not move. So this allows us to link historical experiences to future outcomes for those that experience the event. And this is what we find when we do that. So Black adults exposed to the Red Summer violence as children showed statistically significant lower education attainment in 1940. So that's the first year that the Census Bureau measured or asked about educational attainment. Before they would just ask if they were going to school or not. And the most pronounced impact was that among Black children in upper and lower secondary education, mostly lower secondary. So we could see that in this graph here. So for lower secondary school students that experience Red Summer as children have about a 0.7 year drop in years, 0.7 years of schooling drop or reduction in 1940. And that may not seem like a lot, but at this time, the mean years of schooling was a lot lower. And there was also a time where public education was expanding, or at least access to public education was expanding in order to provide the skills necessary to prosper in quickly industrialized society. And some of the mechanisms we point out here, which is sometimes as difficult as the methodological challenges itself. So that's some of the findings that we have. Moving on to the panel segment, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We're very fortunate today to have two speakers who approach these questions from distinct but complementary perspectives. One communication, the other and political communication, the other through literature. So our first panelist, Tuva Birgas, is a leading Norwegian journalist and longtime foreign correspondent for the NRK. She has spent much of her career in the U.S., covering American politics, social issues, and foreign affairs, notably during the Obama years. She has published the book, Fear and Change, Barack Obama's USA. Her reporting brings a unique global and historically informed perspective to American political life, helping audiences in Norway and beyond understand how the issue of race, inequality, and democracy are interwoven in U.S. society. Our second panelist, Bruce Barnhart, is Associate Professor of American Literature at the University of Oslo, where he co-directs two projects, Literature, Rights, and Imagined Communities, as well as Temporal Experiments. His acclaimed book, Jazz in the Time and in the Time of the novel, examines how artistic and literary forms challenge inherent ideas about property, rights, and temporality. Together, Tuva and Bruce invite us to consider how the stories we tell, whether in the newsroom, classroom, or in cultural spaces, both reflect and reshape the understanding of justice and democracy. So I'll turn it over to Tuva, who will speak introduction first.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thank you. Let's see if I can do this. Thanks so much for inviting me here. I really enjoy speaking to this kind of an audience, and I think this topic is just really important, and I'm glad that you guys are doing research on this in an American context, because I think it's sometimes hard for us to understand what is different between the U.S. and Norway and Europe. Sorry, okay. So if that pops up there, yes. So I have spent about 20 years in the U.S. total. I did my master's at Johns Hopkins back before 9/11. And then I returned as a journalist in 2006, on and off until this year. So I was there for Obama's first election, I was there for Trump's first election, and I was there for the 2024 election. And that has made it possible for me to sort of witness what has changed and how the country has evolved. I did write a book in 2011 called Fear and Change, Barack Obama's United States. I was not really happy at that time with the book. I thought it was really hard to write a book. I'm a journalist. I speak for 1 minute and 30 seconds most of the time. but the title Fear and Change, I sort of focused on the fear that a lot of people felt when the U.S. got a black president. And I feel like that's kind of what happened, right? It sort of traced the beginning of the Tea Party movement. And then today, I think that a lot of what we're seeing today is also with Trump and the fear that a lot of white people are feeling of the change in their country. We did say about 10 years ago that we thought that demographic change and the young generation would change U.S. politics, but it's much slower than what many of us expected, because I think people are not ready for the U.S. to become more of a multicultural society. And I think that has to do with this legacy that Adrian was just speaking about. This seminar is about violence. And so I wanted to share with you, actually two old, if I can get this to work here, two old video clips of stories that I have done years ago that I think sort of can give us some context as to what we're talking about here. I have a clip from Macomb, Mississippi in 2008, just before Obama's election. Macomb, Mississippi is a small town in Mississippi, Britney Spears' birthplace, actually. And this is a place that was one of the first places that experienced the violence of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. I went there to do a story about, I think there was some kind of anniversary. I called an older lady who ran a museum, a civil rights museum in this small town, in her home, asking if we could speak to her. And when I arrived there, she was about I guess she was about 15 or 16 years old back in 1961 when this all started. And when I arrived there, 15 people were waiting for me, or for me and my cameraman. And I experienced that they had never really had that much interest in, let me just stop this for a second. That they really had not experienced that people wanted to hear their story that much. And so in this small town, we're just going to hear a short piece of this story here. I'm speaking Norwegian a little bit in the beginning. Apologies to those of you who don't speak Norwegian. But what I'm saying is basically that I'm arriving and there's 15 people waiting for me. The idea here is that some of these people, they were like freshmen and sophomores in high school when they participated in a pray-in at the steps of the courthouse in their town, and experienced some horrendous violence, some of them that they're talking about here. And then after we hear from them, we go to the local high school to sort of hear a little bit about what this looks like to young people today. So let's see if the audio is if you can hear this. Let's see.
Tax 2 years straight, and then you had to go and read a book that they had at the courthouse. Then you had to write what you thought that meant, honor the Constitution.
I'm saying the right to vote is now nothing to take for granted for these people. Yes.
When I sat in my car, they came over and said, and they used the N-word, get out of the car and pick up the paper. put the paper down, so I told him I wasn't going to pick it up. Well, needless to say, the gentleman drew his revolver and he put it in the back of my head. When he did that, he made me get out of the car, threw me on the car, handcuffed me, and put me in the back of, I later found out to be a patrol car. I was hit in the mouth. The blood went everywhere. I was hit in the back of my head. And at that time, the officer took a gun, his gun, took all of the bullets out except one, put the gun to my head, and pulled the trigger. And when I got to the jail, he did the same thing again, but he put it to the front of my head, and he pulled the trigger. And I was shaking like a leaf on a tree at that time.
How has this influenced your life?
It motivated me to vote and tell somebody else to vote and tell them to tell somebody else to vote.
Okay, let's get a white person.
So this is from the high school.
He's going to be just a white citizen. Okay? And you're going to be a black woman. I don't know how role play works. I'm just read it.
Men på den videregående skolen i Mekong må lærere likevel jobbe hardt for å få avgangselevene sine til å forstå at stemmerett ikke alltid har vært en selvfølge.
Race and civil rights, I don't know too much.
They are not aware, and it's the most remarkable experience because you would think that they would be.
I dag mer enn 90% av elevene
So 90% of the kids here are African Americans in this school.
foreldre sender barna sine på dyre privatskoler i nærheten. Og det velgere som setter den politiske
Mississippi? Most likely John McCain. Because most of the state tends to lean towards the Republicans or conservative side.
Yeah, so the point with the anti was just that these kids were taking civil rights as, I think, an elective in high school. They don't really know the story of their own parents. And I spoke to some of the parents who said that they still thought that it was hard to talk about what they experienced as teenagers. And I think that tells a lot about what sort of, this is in the deep South, but, and again, like John McCain won the election there in 2008, Donald Trump won it twice. People are still voting Republican. I think also after the legacy. So I think that, I mean, it has always stayed with me because I think the incredible violence that this guy, he was a young teenager at the time, is talking about, and then nobody's really interested in listening to his story. That does something to a society, I think, when that happens. Then, as we moved forward in my career in the U.S., Obama is elected. There's a lot of hope, and then Black Lives Matter riots start in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri. And people are not happy with how they're being treated with the police. And it's not really possible to change this fast at all. So then I think that underlying, what we're having a hard time understanding in Europe, perhaps, is sort of what, if a society once traded human beings like the US did, and Europe did that too, but the US did it for much longer. There's also some underlying brutalization of society, and there's an ingrained fear, at least that's my experience, that has stayed with people. And the other clip I wanted to show you is from Ferguson in 2014 after Michael Brown. If you remember, Michael Brown was a young teenager who was shot. He was 18 years old. He was shot in this suburb, or it's a small town outside of St. Louis. We went there and followed I can actually start it and then I'll talk on top of it. And followed some of the young people who had been protesting. The National Guard had been pulled in at this point. And as we are, sorry, I'm just going to fast forward this a little bit. Let's see. So as we are following some of these young people who are protesting, there's a white guy who pulls up in his minivan. And he is so angry. And that's what I wanted to show you, because I think that shows sort of, this is another part of the legacy of violence, that it creates fear in all sides of the US, also with white people. And it's a big reason why where we were at today with Donald Trump and sort of people going into their echo chambers. We're following here a couple of kids and this kid named Brandon, and all of a sudden a guy pulls up in his minivan. This is Brandon here. She's out protesting.
Some people were acting off for their emotions. Some people were acting off because he was killed. But some people were just out here because, you know what I'm saying, it was an opportune time. Take pictures and just put in a time capsule for my son.
He has a baby in the back.
His name is Justice. Yeah. You see every day on the news out here, there's always shootings over here. There's always this, there's always that. An officer made a mistake, and this is the price that we, the Americans, have to pay. I'm not being racist, but us white people don't do this. We get killed all the time by black people, and we don't protest and we don't fight. We just accept life for the way it is. You need to step away from my van. You need to step away from my van because I have a different belief than you. This is what we deal with. Took the wrong route, and the police officer came and cut him down. He was I don't care. So now you wait. I ain't racist. You should step away from me. You don't know what's going on out here. I am licensed to carry concealed weapon. You should step away. I got these hands. Well, please come out. I ain't know about racism. You come off with it. I didn't say anything about white or black. I said police officers. You see what we do?
Yeah. So it's not very inspiring, perhaps, but it's. But this is. I mean, again, a story that this just happened. We didn't plan this. This just happened. And I think another part of the violence is also, of course, the need to be armed. People are afraid of losing their rights to own weapons all over the U.S. society. Very different from what it's like in Europe. It is the Second Amendment, but it's also something else. And I think that is fear and the fear of losing the freedom to protect yourself. And so what I've been asking myself over all these years is like how do you change this? And sort of can the young generation growing up today, which is a very multicultural US generation, are they going to be able to change it? And are we going to have a different kind of politician? Maybe kind of like Obama. I guess in a way, a lot of people say that Obama was like 20 years ahead of his time, you know, that he was. But I'm not, right now, I feel like young people are they have enough just sort of surviving, protecting themselves, making sure that they actually do get an education. So I think that the reason why I wanted to show these two clips is that I think the first one shows that their parents' generation, it's so close, like they can't even, some places even talk about what they went through. And the young people are out there with all these guns. And also meeting, I've covered a lot of the protests, the ones in Ferguson, the ones in Minnesota, for instance, after George Floyd, the ones in LA now in June. And there are not that many people out in the streets when they send in the National Guard. I mean, there's not like thousands of people. I mean, it's not, it feels weird like coming there, seeing a couple of hundred kids out in the street and being met by this enormous force. Also, I think does something to young people. There's riot police in Europe, but I don't think you have much larger crowds, I think, there when it's being met in the way it is. So this is just a little taste or two little stories, but I think, again, I'm sort of worried about where we go from here. I do have hope in Gen Z and sort of that they are sort of, my own son is 15 years old. He grew up in the US. I feel that he's colorblind in a way. having grown up in DC in a very diverse school, but I still wonder sort of how long, history that a lot of the African American kids there have had also with their own families, what it does to your psyche and the ability you have to sort of create a good future for yourself. Thank you.
Welcome to stay seated if you want, or wherever.
Maybe I'll just sit down here if nobody minds. That was really powerful, and I kind of thought I knew what I was going to say, but again, as many days that I wake up and look at the news in the U.S., I'm kind of shaken. So, and this idea of a certain personality type or form of personhood that is inherited from the past, that's very much what I've been thinking about and what I want to talk about. We inherit economic structures, but we also inherit cultural structures. And some of those cultural structures are forms of identity, right? And so this dude in the minivan is exhibiting a form of whiteness that shares similarities to things in the past. And so Adrian quoted Faulkner about the past is not over, it's not even past. And so one of the things that's really been guiding my research is the work of James Baldwin. And so I'll just read a quote from James Baldwin. And Baldwin says, "It is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations." And so the guy in the minivan, right, he's enacting history on a certain level. And also, if you want to understand anything about race in the United States, you got to read James Baldwin, and he's been a great help to me in doing my own research. I've been working on a book that's about done on the history of capital and race in the U.S. in the 20th and 21st centuries. So I'm very interested in the continuum, as Adrian says, and continuity is what I think about more than anything else. Legacy is a great, title. And you can understand the word in a lot of different ways, but legacy tends to suggest that someone or something has died and that they've left something behind for us that are alive, right? They've bequeathed something. But the fact is, and it's obvious, but it's worth saying, is that racial violence in the U.S. just has not died. It's not over, right? And so we know that it's been a little over 5 years since George Floyd was killed by a police officer who put his knee on his neck for 8 minutes. And we know that since then, police violence against civilians in the U.S. has just increased. And we know that the differential rate of the targeting of citizens in the U.S. by race has increased or gone up. Right? So in the U.S. in 2025, if you are Black, you are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be the target of police violence than if you're white. Right? So that's important. But it seems perhaps more important in thinking about the present to think about structural violence as well as physical violence, right? So we know that racism is physical, as in, the violation of George Floyd and the death of George Floyd, but it's also structural, as in the case of the hundreds of thousands of Black men and women deprived of adequate housing, adequate access to health care, adequate access to jobs and other resources crucial to living a human life. And that's what we'd call structural violence. So we're talking about continuities. So let's just think back, if we can, for about a quarter of a century, 1998, 27 years ago, if my math is right. It turns out that white household wealth in the U.S. is greater than Black household wealth. And of course, that surprises nobody here. But how much greater, we might ask, right? So it turns out in 1998, white household wealth was not double that of Black household wealth. It was not triple. It was not 4 times, it was actually 6.5 times as much as that of average Black household wealth. Right? So we might ask, what's changed in 2025? And sadly, the answer is probably not much. Right? So at the beginning of 2025, the Federal Reserve says that white household wealth was 6 times greater than Black household wealth. Right? So that's a sharp marker of inequality. And more importantly than that, that's a sharp marker of the way in which structural violence continues to work more on Black communities than it does on white communities. Right now, money and wealth is not everything, but it's a marker of an inability to control one's surroundings, an inability to insulate oneself from, physical violence, structural violence, inadequate access to housing, inadequate access to healthcare, inadequate access to nutritious food and all sorts of things. These are the markers of the persistence of structural and physical violence in the U.S. So why, we need to ask, does racial violence persist in the United States? So the reasons are economic and political, but they are also cultural, including first and foremost an intense investment in the continuity of existing social structures, an investment that is accompanied by an intense unwillingness to confront the past. And this is part of what we see with the guy in the van. To confront the past, and more than that, to confront the ways in which the past live on in the present. We could call this investment in continuity and this aversion to confronting the past whiteness. And I would say, if we think about the forces standing in the way of any kind of real or transformative change in race relations in the United States, whiteness is of crucial importance. So one of the important but often overlooked legacies of racial violence in the U.S. is not a tangible thing, but an intangible and persistently powerful set of intellectual and mental habits. This is whiteness, a set of mental habits produced in the past which continue to form both a worldview and a form of identity that exercises a powerful hold on the American imagination. The history and legacy of racial violence in the U.S. created a set of attitudes and assumptions about how the world works and how society should function. Over time, the set of allegedly common sense attitudes about the racialized structure of the U.S. hardened into a discrete form of personhood, i.e., they established an identity, that of whiteness. So first, the historical system of racial inequality, racial subordination, and racial violence creates a set of expectations and beliefs among those who benefit from or believe they benefit from the system. Then this set of expectations hardens into an established and usually unconscious, tacit, or assumed worldview. At the same time, these expectations and corresponding worldview become powerfully bound up with people's sense of themselves. In other words, the assumptions of a social system set up by dint of racial violence become internalized or hardwired into an identity to which many individuals attach great importance. Right? And that kind of emotional or affective attachment to identity is important. So once this happened, once the set of racialized expectations becomes an identity, and it first happened sometime in the 18th century, if not before. Once this happens, then attempts to change the existing social structure tend to be perceived as threats to individual identity. If I am emotionally or psychologically invested in how I fit into the existing world, then when somebody attempts to substantially change this world, I can easily feel as if something is being taken away from me. In American culture, this often occurs even if the individuals who feel threatened will not actually lose anything if the proposed changes are enacted. So this is one of the ways that whiteness comes to serve as a powerful obstacle to any attempt to move towards racial justice. Whiteness as an identity creates a powerful set of attachments to real or perceived advantages, which creates a real and often intense aversion to any kind of structural or systemic change. This aversion is accompanied by a stubborn unwillingness or inability to confront the past. Right? So whiteness doesn't want to think about 1919 in the way in which the racial violence of 1919 continues to structure the present. So, it's obvious, but worth stating that it's important to distinguish between whiteness and white people. Whiteness is both an accrued set of powers and privileges on the one hand, and a set of attitudes about the world on the other, a kind of worldview. Different individuals within the United States participate in whiteness to a greater or lesser extent. There are different levels of commitment to whiteness, and as I will suggest in a second or two, there are different forms or models of whiteness. So one of the key expectations of whiteness is that the unequal playing field of the present will extend into the future. The racialized structure of American society grants substantially easier access to good jobs, good education, good housing, and other goods to white citizens. Over time, whiteness as an identity comes to take this privileged ease of access as the natural course of things. Indeed, a crucial part of whiteness is the misperception of this differential access as a neutral baseline against which any change should be measured. Whiteness leads or encourages white citizens to see existing ingrained inequality as neutrality or even fairness. And this is the main reason for whiteness's aversion to confronting the past, which of course, exposes the falsehood of this. Whiteness also pushes citizens to see any attempt to change this inequality as an assault upon their perceived rights or even their very being. Okay, so right now in 2025, and in the past to a certain extent, the United States has both overt forms of this hostility to structural change on the one hand, and more subtle or covert forms on the other. So to really understand the workings of race in the United States, one had us to understand there are two fairly distinct kinds of whiteness. One we could call reactionary whiteness, and the other we could call liberal whiteness. The first, reactionary whiteness, is more overt and is the kind of venomous commitment to white supremacy that tends to show up in the newspaper or on TV. The second is much more covert, liberal whiteness, often almost invisible, and it often does not require any conscious commitment to racism or anti-blackness. When liberal whiteness speaks, it rarely uses overtly racial or racist language. Instead, it tends to use the language of economic rationality, common sense, and of belief in a form of progress imagined as either inevitable or automatic. If liberal whiteness does use the language of race, its most common utterance is some version of the phrase, "I am not a racist." So liberal whiteness is much more common than reactionary whiteness, and while it rarely leads to overt physical violence, it is a crucial factor in the continuing structural violence directed at African Americans and other people of color in the United States. So liberal whiteness is, among other things, a distracting misrepresentation of the real nature of racial inequality and racial violence. So it's important to acknowledge liberal whiteness because there is a certain economic inertia governing the way racial inequalities of the past and present translate themselves into the future. In the housing market and the job market, as in other areas, racial inequality is so deeply ingrained that unless some powerful force challenges their routine working, they will continually or even automatically reproduce racialized structural violence. So, and I'm not saying that reactionary whiteness is not important, but, we need to think about the different versions of it and the way in which, there's this kind of machinery of generating inequality and structural violence over and over again. So I would say that the most important goal in the U.S. right now is to create institutions and policies capable of addressing ongoing structural and physical anti-Black violence in the U.S. This goal cannot be reached, I don't think, without taking into account the continuing force of whiteness as a set of attitudes hostile to structural change. And so you could say a lot about the way in which some of the overt acts of the Trump administration are a kind of increased investment in whiteness, and the way in we're in a moment of reaction against some of the opening that followed the killing of George Floyd in 2020, right? The protests, willingness to examine history. But I'll just stop there and saying, we should really think about these different forms of whiteness, not as separate from economic and political issues, but as necessarily engaged in or as part of a larger kind of examination of structural systems and, hopefully attempt to change or transform them.
I forgot my questions. Thank you, both of you, for those very interesting, insightful remarks. So I always want to take some moment to sort of maybe sort of bring that understanding and from a vantage point here in Norway, you're both maybe uniquely positioned to answer this question of an American living in Oslo and a Norwegian who spent many years in the U.S. So what do you think is the most misunderstood? Is the most misunderstood about the legacies of racial violence in the United States from our vantage point here in Norway, and why would you say that's the case? And where do you think this misunderstanding of racial violence in the U.S. States stems from?
I think that how violent it actually has been is an important misunderstanding. Where the people can't really grasp or feel how much violence people have been exposed to, and how this differs from, for instance, most, I guess, immigrants experience in Europe, for instance. And then I also think that this is coupled with the fact that the U.S. is, and maybe we speak more about this. It's an intensely competitive society where education is key to climbing the ladder, and that also makes, there's also that, I think what you said about liberal whiteness is really interesting. It also creates, is the cake big enough for everyone, right? There's been the debate about affirmative action, and recently, like taking away sort of some opportunities for instance, descendants of slaves to apply to get a little bit of a easier way into the college system, for instance.
Yeah.
So I think that these things, that it's just a fundamentally different society, and I'm really big on like income differences and how that creates a society. But I think that those two things are the most important ones.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I got
Yeah.
involved in the answer.
Yeah. So what do you think is the most misunderstood about the legacies of racial violence in the United States, and why, from our vantage point here from Norway? And where does this misunderstanding about the legacies of racial violence stem from?
Well, I can't pretend that I have any kind of deep understanding of Norwegians or Norwegian culture, but I think there's a strong sense to think in Norway and in the U.S. about a past that's somehow distant and a present. Right? And part of this is, I think, because there's so much attention, rightly so, on the liberation movement and the civil rights movement of the 60s. So I think there's a tendency to think that there was a moment of Jim Crow and overt violence, and now we're in something else. That maybe, the U.S. is still racist. And so I think that's the big misunderstanding, that there's, as you spoke, there's a continuum. And I think that most people don't understand that it is a continuum, right? And so, if we're in this Trump moment or this reactionary moment, you could date it to 2013 when the Supreme Court, takes back some of the key or eviscerates one of the key civil rights legislative achievements, the 1964 Voting Rights Act. Right? So there's this, long continuum of a struggle over who has access to resources. And I think the best way to understand it is, as you've rightly said, it's ongoing. So I think, to me, that seems to be, that seems to be the biggest understanding. There's a past, and then there's some kind of break, and then there's the present. And we really want to think about the past living on, as Faulkner and Baldwin and all sorts of other intellectuals would tell us. That's what I would say.
Yeah. And no, sorry.
I'm much more familiar with the U.S., and one of the reasons I haven't learned about as much as I should about Norwegian politics and things is because I'm kind of, furiously engaged with American politics on a daily basis. But I think people want to talk about racism as if it lives in somebody's head or somebody's heart, when it really lives in structure, in economic structures. It's everywhere. And so one of the things liberal whiteness wants to do is point somewhere else. Look at those poorly educated white folks living in Appalachia or something. That's racism over there. Right? So to see it as isolated individual people rather than as part of the ongoing political, social, and economic structure of the U.S. I think that's a really persistent mistake. And people want to point out that person's racist or that person's not racist. But really the thing is to think about the kind of racism and the results of the system.
And to your last point, I think we see that in Europe too. The U.S. is influencing European or Scandinavian political debate.
Yes, I'm sorry.
For these for these anti-immigrant parties, for instance, and the opposition to political correctness about talking about what things actually are, right? So I think Trump has brought a lot of things to the surface that people didn't dare talk about before, and maybe that's good, but it has been coupled with social media, meaning that people go into their echo chambers and then it doesn't turn into debate; it just turns into silos.
Yeah, no, I remember. I was here in at Prio in 2020 when the COVID was happening, but also when there was the George Floyd protests. And so, are those sort of opportunities to maybe expand our understanding of of the continuum in the U.S. when this story breaks of police brutality, of police killing.
I think maybe people see it more clearly. At that time, I think there was even like BLM in Norway, right? And people started talking about their own rights, and there was a great solidarity. I think people see the pictures on TV, but it's still hard to understand what it feels like. I think being in Minneapolis, in those neighborhoods, or being George Floyd, right? I mean, being like on the ground with that knee to your neck, and like these kids I was talking about in Ferguson, like being stopped for walking while black, like people say, right? I mean, I don't think it's not the same, but I think it brings attention to it, and maybe it makes it a little bit, it makes it more visual and understandable maybe here.
Yeah.
So you're asking about that moment, the 2020?
Yeah, no, because I mean, I was here in Oslo, and I remember there was protests in front of the U.S. Embassy
Right.
During that time, and there was a lot of discussion even here at Prio on those events going on in the U.S.
Yeah, I think it was a moment of great opening, and in some subtle ways, but also in some very overt ways, the Trump policies are an explicit reaction to that moment. So in 2019, you have Hannah Nicole Jones publishing the 1619 Project at New York Times, which later became a book. So people are thinking about the history. Black Lives Matter did all this excellent work up to in 2020. So that set the stage for that summer, in which there were protests all over the U.S., not only in large cities and medium-sized and small cities. And people were really, public discourse really changed for a while, And it was at all levels, from politicians to journalists to like people talking in church or on their front porch, community groups. And people were talking who had not talked before about racism. And they were talking about racism in terms of structural racism and institutional racism. And so those are the things that the Trump administration is overtly trying to, actually kind of ban or make illegal, right? So there's an executive order of Trump in 2020. We need to get rid of certain divisive concepts as language. And the I word, institutional racism, and the S word, structural racism, are two of those things that were attempted to ban. And there, at least 36 different states have made different laws, kind of banning the use of that language. So that's that, like, whiteness as a certain kind of aversion to thinking about structural change into the past. And that was a moment in which people were interrogating racial violence and race, and people were interrogating whiteness. And I think the hold of whiteness was kind of loosening a little bit. And now we're in a kind of, that frightened overtly, clearly, the Trump administration, but, and other people in all sorts of other ways. And we're in this moment of reaction against that. But to me, that's a really hopeful moment, because all sorts of people were engaged and were thinking about themselves, and the world in totally different ways.
I also don't think that COVID brought Americans further apart, because people were at home for so long. Like the liberal whites you're talking about. I mean, they were like cooped up in their nice houses in Washington, D.C., for instance, not going out and seeing these protests, right? And then now, today, with Trump coming back, people are also kind of apathetic in a way, because they've also been there before. I think a lot of people are just like, I'm just going to sit this one out. I'm just going to stay at home, and like, now there's a shutdown. It's like people are used to just work. If you're wealthy, right, you can just work from home and just isolate yourself from society. It's become easier, and that there was a greater fear between Americans that came from COVID, and I think that made it harder to bridge these gaps, to sort of to mend this, to make also. I mean, I also agree with you, but I think that there was something with that aspect as well that was stronger there than here, because we opened up sooner.
Yeah, I mean, you can't argue that COVID was not important.
Right.
I don't know exactly how, but
And I think we don't really know how important it was yet, because people don't really want to talk about it. And we don't talk about all the people who died. But the people in the U.S. who really got credit for COVID were the governors who opened up their states first. Florida, Georgia, they won by landslides in the 2022 election, like Ron DeSantis and what's his name, Kemp down in Georgia, who opened up first, because people didn't like that the government was taking over their lives.
So this sort of blends into the next point, or the next question I have is, so Tua, you spoke about fear and sort of the difficulty of sort of the cycle of fear of change, of fear of not being able to protect yourself, and then sort of the reaction to that. It can generate more fear. And Bruce, you then went to go speak about sort of like the blindness of whiteness. So when it comes to addressing these legacies, so what would be a powerful or essential ingredient for progress? This institutional policy-driven change, or cultural resistance and identity building that can be forged within those affected communities, those marginalized and minoritized communities, like in this case, the African American community.
I mean, I think the important thing is to, propose and push for policies. I'm a little bit skeptical of the kind of idea of these kind of sessions where white people are trained to encounter their own privilege and all sorts of things like that, the Beverly D'Angelo model. Although, whatever, she's doing great work and she's doing more than I am, so that's important. But I think, foregrounding what are the conditions, which I think many Americans are ignorant of in terms of, housing, which is a very hot button issue, and, all sorts of different things, and proposing policies that would address that. And, I think linking that to history, right? So the more that you're exposed to history, real history, the more, that's kind of like the kryptonite of whiteness, right? It kind of fades because it's predicated upon a suppression of history. And so I would say the important things are, one, to propose actual, policies that will bring about some kind of real or structural change, and to do the kind of thing that, Nicole Hannah-Jones and others have been doing, is really foreground the history. The 1919 Chicago race riot, I just don't think people in the U.S. know about that. I mean, of course, that's the one I know the most about. But those things and the results of them, the legacies of them, which you're tracing in a really think important way, that is not knowledge that circulates that much. So the more that knowledge circulates, and the more it's connected to questions about what should be done about it, I think the better off we would be. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that you need to bridge the differences, but I think the U.S. is not at the point yet where everyone can be the same, and the U.S. wants to be a diverse society, and people have different histories. And as I showed in my clips, there's a lot of discussions that still need to be had, and a lot of confidence that still needs to be built. Maybe it's the next generation of kids who will tell their kids about what their grandparents experienced in the civil rights movement. So I think that building, African American identity is still important. It's still important that you have predominantly Black colleges in the U.S. I mean, I have a lot of friends who I know a lot of young kids who want to go to more African American college because they want to they don't want to go to Harvard and feel left out with all the kids who've much more money than them necessarily, right? And actually, it's interesting, in the clip I showed from Ferguson, where the guy, the white guy in the van, my cameraman who filmed that, he is from Harlem. He was standing there behind the camera. He is Black. He grew up in Harlem in the 1980s. And the guy didn't really sort of, it's like he didn't register that he was actually Black, But he is one of my dear friends who would never live in the neighborhood I lived in Washington, which was very white. He wants to be in a more diverse neighborhood. I think you still need to have some affirmative action in different communities. And I think that's what happened during Obama. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Ta-Nehisi Coates, an excellent writer. He wrote a book called Between the World and Me, which is a bestseller that he wrote to his 15-year-old son during the BLM movement. But he also wrote an excellent article, I think it was in the Atlantic or the New Yorker, called "We Were 4 Years in Power After Obama was out of the White House and Trump took over, where it really describes this feeling that he had being that his people were in the White House, right? And what that meant to the building of confidence. And this is what I think during the Obama years in the White House, I mean, Michelle Obama, for instance, did so much work bringing young girls into the White House, creating, building confidence, showing people that everything is possible. And it's not naive. It's very, very important, I think. And I still think that needs to be done too. So you can't just everyone can't be, you need to still work on programs.
And so this seems to be a sort of like a reoccurring theme in U.S. history. You have Reconstruction, which is this time in which they attempted to address some of the the historical legacy from slavery, and then you have the Civil Rights Movement, which brought down the Jim Crow. But then you also have these reactionary movements, after and during Reconstruction, great extreme violence, and Civil Rights Movement also violence. But then there's sort of this swing later on in the 80s, and we're sort of in the era right now again. And I'm just wondering, what do you think why do we go through these? We make great progress in some sense, in some realms, and then we sort of don't want to go anymore, or there's fear comes in, or someone comes in and says this is wrong, or so I'm just wondering your thoughts on sort of this pendulum that we seem to constantly.
You're more of a historian than me, I think.
Well, I think I don't really like talking about pendulums because it suggests some kind of natural movement that goes independent of people's desires. But there's an intense investment, commitment to a certain kind of reaction, right? There's money and power invested in maintaining certain power relations. And, the baseline in the U.S., Hannah Nicole Jones, I don't, need to overmention her, said a couple of months ago, I think, is reaction or retrogression. That's the baseline, right? And then there are these moments, as you pointed out, Reconstruction. Sometimes people call the 60s a second Reconstruction, and there was glimmers of it in 2021 that open, and then there's reaction. And so we know that there was this huge backlash against the gains of the liberation movement and the civil rights movement of the 60s. One of these things was this establishment of all sorts of think tanks and institutions to try and work on public, opinion, right? So in 1973, and this is this moment of backlash against the civil rights and Black liberation movement, the Heritage Foundation was formed. Right? Paul Weyrich and I can't remember the other dude's name, the two conservative activists. And they're like, okay, we need to get people to think differently. We need to get this idea of structural change totally outside of the realm of common sense. Okay, so that's 1973, and that's the backlash against what I like to call the Second Reconstruction following Reverend William Barber.
Right.
So Project 2025 comes out of the Heritage Foundation, right? So this institution established in 1973 as reaction to the movement of the 60s has created the playbook for a lot of Trump administration's policies explicitly. So, there is a lot of money and a lot of power invested in suppressing any notion of structural change. And I know I've said this phrase too many times, but we have a structural problem, and to really address it, we need structural change. And so the strategy of whiteness and people like the Heritage Foundation, like the Trump administration, is to create an aura of the way in which people talk about things. It's like, that just seems ridiculous, right? Zoran Mamdani talks about this idea of a government grocery store. A lot of Americans, they're like, what? That's like seems like as if you've talked about, a grocery store run by aliens or something like that. It's totally out of the realm of what it is. So, there's this whiteness is an attempt to really constrain the vision, right? The past is outside of it and other possibilities are outside of it. And so, the part of the backlash is that people plan it. They're invested in it and they do specific political and rhetorical things to, kind of keep that backlash, that repetitive backlash movement going again and again.
I think that's an important point, and there's an entire industry also around. I mean, now what happened between the forming of Heritage Foundation and Project 2025 today.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole
It's the same
industry. There's
institution.
What Charlie Kirk created. There is, there is all, and then there is the silos and the social media and all the, and that it's so much harder today to bring people together because everyone is in their own space. And then on top of all that, there's also
And those groups are well funded.
Right.
I mean, that's, I think, an important point.
Absolutely, very well funded, and there's so much of it that, I mean, it's an entire sort of society, and I think if you go to CPAC these days, or this big Republican conference every year, we found all these groups there. Of course, there's also groups on the other side, and a lot of people ask me, I mean, what are the Democrats doing? What, I mean, so I'm thinking, not that I'm going to be asking the questions, but sort of during the Obama years, what did they what did they change anything?
Did the Obama administration change
did the
anything?
years with Obama in the White House change what we're talking about at all?
Well, there
didn't really
was,
mention
I've been working a lot on the housing industry. And during the Obama administration, his attorney general was Merrick Garland. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he successfully prosecuted a number of cases against redlining.
Right.
Well, I don't know. I mean, he got settlements from these big mortgage companies. And so, we think of redlining as primarily like 60s and 70s and establishing institution. It's illegal after the Fair Housing Act of 1968, but it persists, of course. And so Merrick Garland won cases against mortgage companies that were practicing forms of redlining in 2021 and 2023.
Meaning
so real
keeping
recent.
certain groups out of certain neighborhoods, kind of, right?
Yeah. And discriminating in terms of what houses could be sold to black homeowners and what kind of loans they could get. Right. It's a continuation of this whole subprime loans for black people, and so that's part of what the Obama administration did. But it really was a liberal administration.
Right.
In many ways. And it did, work for certain kinds of change. It wanted to do so subtly. And, it wasn't about large, bold initiatives or reforms. And partially because of COVID, you actually saw more attempts to do more dramatic economic changes with the Biden administration, at least in the first, 1 or 2.5 years. But it's a very mixed bag, I think, the legacy of the Obama administration. I mean, the first thing I think about is when he went to Flint and drank a glass of water, which just makes me mad, but.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think in the last maybe 15 minutes or so, we can turn it over to the audience and wonderful audience and see if anyone has any questions for our panelists, anything we discussed today.
Great.
Hi. I had a question about kind of, meta reflections of what you do. So, as you mentioned several times, there is by far not enough literature on racial violence in general, and also in the U.S. That said, the U.S. and the U.S. context has often been in the forefront of the already limited literature on racial violence, both in terms of research with like the Dole study of Mamie and Kenneth Clark, but also non-research, non-scientific literature like the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, Narratives of a Slave. And so I was curious kind of to hear your reflections about how that literature may impact the legacies of racial violence and the identities or racial identities and narratives, both in general, but also kind of your contributions specifically, your literature, your journalism, like how you think it impacts, but also how you hope it may impact. And then a kind of B question, I was also curious about your reflections of this outside of the US. Like, for instance, in Norway, there are strong indications of like stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination of Latin American populations deriving from ideas of the US and the US context specifically, as opposed to the Norwegian context. So kind of how you feel about the impact of literature, both in general, but also your own, both within the US context, but also outside.
Interesting.
Do you want to go first, Adrian?
Yeah, I can go first. Yeah, so I mean, this project started 4 years ago, and we wrote the proposal in 2020 or 2021, I forget now. But it was in response to the George Floyd protests, and I guess at the time, that the hope was that creating this new project that specifically focused on racial violence in the United States, because there had been other research on different countries, and sort of dealing with their legacies of, say, civil war in Spain, and in the U.S. There is research on how slavery impacts white attitudes. That they find that it reduces support in areas where slavery was highly concentrated. It reduces support for policies like affirmative action, and so I guess we set out to sort of move beyond, or to understand that that the violence did not stop with slavery. That there was 150, 100 years after that, there was still ongoing violence throughout that time. So I guess the hope was to sort of bring, in terms of scholarly research, to bring that understanding of how violence can impact the population that was being undertaken in different countries like Colombia, like Spain, and bring that understanding to the United States. And so that was the goal, and the hope is that this research is expanded upon, and sort of we build upon that footprint that we try to establish, in order to hopefully in the long run impact policies and bring attention to this. And it starts with acknowledging what has occurred and its effects.
Did you? I mean, you asked about literature, and so I mentioned James Baldwin, who I think is a great guide, and the other person that I think is a great guide is W.E.B. Du Bois, who is usually referred to as a sociologist, although he did so many different things that you could call him a historian or a journalist or a political activist. But he also wrote 5 novels. And he speaks convincingly, to me at least, about the way in which the novel and other literary forms can do things that social science can't. And for him, that's about that interaction between large social structures and more intimate, like personal desires and ambitions, right? And so that, describes a lot of the ways in which people react to what possibilities for building coalitions and things like that. So I think there has been this long tradition going at least back to Frederick Douglass, probably going back to Olaudah Equiano before him, of thinking about literary forms, the slave narrative, the novel, and all sorts of things like that, as a place to really do the kind of interdisciplinary critique that is required to address, anti-Black violence. And I think of people doing that today. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a good example. Claudia Rankine, usually described as a poet, but her works, Citizen from 2014 and Just Us from 2020, it's hard to figure out what they are, but they're doing really interesting work. And she has this institute, I think it's called the Racial Imaginary Institute. And so what I've been talking about is a kind of cultural form, is like, what are the structures of the way in which Americans exercise their imagination? And she's got this, institute that's examining all the different ways in which we can think about all sorts of different beliefs, habits of thinking are racialized. And so, I'm just saying there's a long line of it, and it's ongoing. And I think, to me, it's an important part of, thinking about the way it works and thinking about possibilities of redress or change.
Just briefly, sort of in the more popularized part of what you mentioned, Bruce, the 1619 Project. That's a podcast and a book, but a podcast seriously came from the New York Times by Hannah Nicole Jones. And there's an episode there about the U.S. economy, which I think is really, I learned so much from talking about sort of the brutalization of capitalism stemming from slavery and violence. And I think I can't remember who's speaking in that episode, but that's a really good. That really explained a lot to me. In addition to Ta-Nehisi Coates, I don't even know if he wrote any books, but I always like listening to Van Jones, who worked for Obama. He's often on CNN, but I think he just has often a way of grasping sort of the now and explaining things, pertaining to these issues that I get a lot from.
Much for a very interesting panel. I have a question that I would like you to reflect upon. I mean, how much does the start of the US influence how people think about race? I mean, this is a colonial power that was founded on violence, which predates slavery and the slave trade. So how much influence do you think this has? And my second question is, given the fact that you now have a leadership in the US that actually encourages racism and violence, what are the solutions? I mean, how can you deal with this as a society when it's endorsed from the top? Thank you.
I mean, I think, and this is part of what I was trying to suggest, that the foundations of the country have everything to do with, the kind of forms of resistance to justice that we see in the U.S., right, under the name of whiteness. And, there's been a lot of work talking about the colonies, particularly Virginia and South Carolina, how at the beginning of the 17th century, you have, an unfree workforce. Right? And it's made up of white indentured servants and black, are they servants? Are they slaves? At the end of the 17th century and in 1705, by, explicit law in Virginia, they will be slaves. But there's this moment in which, we don't quite know how they go together. And so, the people that I read that I find to be convincing scholars are like, over the course of the 17th century, before the foundation of the United States, the solution was to enshrine chattel slavery as the destiny of virtually all black people in the United States, and then to kind of lift up indentured servitude for white people, right? So to create this racial divide and to create a sense of whiteness. So, that's the thing that was created at the end of the 17th or beginning of the 18th century, and that's a thing. It changes, of course, right? So, Malcolm X says there's, like Cadillac brings out a new model every year, there's a new model of whiteness every year as well, right? And so it changes, but, that thing was instituted, and that's the thing that we are, or among other things that we're dealing with today. So I would say everything would be my answer to that first question.
Yeah, and I think it's another thing that's interesting is that the United States was created as something new, right? And people wanted to get away from Europe because they didn't want to have a nobility. They didn't want to have the inherited wealth or positions coming out of Europe. But instead, they created another kind of nobility. Today, there's a nobility in the U.S., which is a financial white nobility, and those families are sending their kids to the best schools. And then there is what came out of creating that society is racial differences, and I think also a lot of violence. I mean, there was also a lot of violence in creating this country. There was even I listened to a lot of podcasts, but there was another podcast series this year from the National Library here in Norway about Norwegian immigration history to the U.S., following some of the immigrants who came there in the mid 1800s, and how even that was, and they experienced a lot of violence creating their lives in the new world, right? So there's this brutalism that I think is different. I mean, we saw it in Brazil, we saw it other places, but there was this brutal. I mean, there was the fight for survival was strong, was hard, and so that created sort of a willingness to discriminate more. And I've forgotten your second question. Sorry. How do you do with this? Yeah, with Trump. Yeah, well, I'm almost thinking today that like it's almost like people are going to get worn out, and then out of that there will come some. I don't think that. I mean, what comes after Trump is crucial. What comes after Trump in the Republican Party is, of course, also crucial. I'm not sure that a J.D. Vance can create the same following because he doesn't have like Trump's kind of grandfatherly sarcasm, which I think is a. I mean, I think people vote for Trump because it's like people are Trump apologists in the U.S. They said, "Oh well, Trump, let Trump be Trump. He's Trump. He says all this stuff, but he does good things for the economy." That's what a lot of people tell me, right? But it's not. I'm not sure if they want to say the same thing about like a J.D. Vance or Pete Hegseth if they want to try and become president, right? So, but I'm also thinking that obviously, the Democrats and sort of I think there's again the liberal whiteness or the liberal U.S. needs to be more honest in how they talk about the future and how and also the discontent that brought the country where it is today, and not be so afraid of keeping their positions. And so I think a big question now is where does the Democratic Party go from here? How do they create? Who do they pick? I'm listening to Pete Buttigieg a lot these days. I think he's the one who's is able to talk to both sides somehow, but people are so sort of cynical about like he's gay or he's like this or he's like that, So it's I think 2028 or I think the period 2026 to 28 is going to be an important period in American history.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you guys very much. I guess my question is the title is Unpacking the Legacies. And one of the legacies I see today is in the States is that children, the largest killer of children is gun violence. And so in one way, this has kind of come to the point where it's not just falling on black or white, it's consuming the entirety. And at the same time, we see a lot of surveys that young people are more pessimistic than they've ever been, ever. And so my question is, who is capable of dealing with this legacy in a country that has not just a violent history, but a violence that has constantly occurred, whether it be hand on skin or structural or an institutional violence? And who is capable, specifically the generation that we're talking, the younger generation, who is capable of dealing with that violence?
That's a really great question. There's a generation now that they're growing up and who are now in their mid-20s who grew up under their desks, right? They grew up hiding under their desks every year in like a drill for school shootings. And my own stepson is one of them. I think that these kids who, it's like, I'm thinking that they can change something but I think it's going to, when they are 50 years old, how are they going to look back on their formative years, right? Is it really necessary? And I think there's so much cynicism connected to the institution of guns in the U.S. and what role it plays in society, and how today's political discourse has been so derailed in terms of talking about how you have to protect yourself against, it's so dangerous, and freedom, and more give the teachers guns and all that. So right now I don't really see a way out of it, and even with the Democratic Party, we've seen how hard it is to change the laws, right? But I just, even though, like you're saying, the young people are it's so hard, right? But they're gonna have to lead this country into the future, and I think, I don't know, I think that they have enough, what they've experienced in their childhoods will form how they see the future of their country. That's the hope I have, but it's just hope, I guess.
During the last question, I was thinking about William Barber, who led the moral majority movement, and now it's what he's got, the Poor People's Movement. So when you talk about gun violence, of course, that's an issue, for black people as well as white people. And that's been Barber's focus, right? Whiteness, works against the interest of poor white people as well as poor black people. So his movement, which I think is fantastic, uses a lot of Christian rhetoric, which is, not so easily for me to align myself with. But it's very effective in terms of like, you know, his book was actually entitled, I think, White Poverty. So he's like, look, we got these problems, and he focuses on poverty, not gun violence. But, you know, there are these issues that are really, you know, kind of grinding down, you know, and just eliminating like real life for Black and white Americans. And his focus, I think, is the right one. These are the things we should focus on, right, for coalition building. Not like, oh, kind of bland, like Black and white people get together, but like, here's the stuff that's killing us, you know, like poverty, like gun violence, like addiction, and all sorts of other things. Those are the things that we should address, and we should address them, you know, as a part of a multiracial coalition, right? And so, you know, there's this long history that Barbara is part of, and says that, you know, race is a way of keeping the bottom levels of American community from getting together, you know, and trying to make demands that would address things like gun violence. So when I think of the movements that are, you know, positive and, you know, have a sense of hope, if not optimism around them, I think of that movement and him. But there are a handful of politicians that are thinking differently. I find myself quite skeptical about the Democratic Party in general. They seem very timid and incapable of addressing, you know, the issues that are facing all sorts of Americans. But there, you know, there's the new generation, you know, the people, like the kind of politicians that follow on the wave of the squad. You know, they're thinking about economics and politics in a different way. It's not the same kind of centrist movement of traditional Democrats. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are some of the things that I think, you know, speak to the moment in, you know, productive ways.
Folks, I want to thank you all for your excellent questions. We're at the end of the time for our seminar, but I wanted to thank our speakers and Adrian for leading us in such a fascinating discussion of such an important topic. Many of the questions and the follow-up dealt with issues of kind of the way forward and what to do next. And so I wanted to give just a quick pitch for our second panel of the seminar today. And we're going to have two experts talking about both issues of redress and mitigation, right? So moving forward from periods of violence and kind of thinking through some of the lessons learned from minority and minoritized communities here in Norway and how those lessons can be applied in the US context. So if you have way forward questions, I would encourage you to kind of stick with us for the second panel, which will start at 11. All right, well, let me call us all back together. Folks, welcome, and thank you for joining us for the second panel of our seminar today on the legacies of racial violence in the US and Norway. As I mentioned, we're live streaming at the moment, so we have additional colleagues who are joining us. I'm not sure the U.S. is awake just yet, but this recording will also be included on YouTube once the seminar is completed. So my name is Cyan Loyal, and I'm a professor at Penn State University in the United States and a research professor here at PRIO. And I've had the pleasure of leading the Legacy project for the last 4 years. It's a project that's funded by the Research Council of Norway, and it's designed to address the legacies of racial violence in the United States, thinking about both the types of violence that was experienced among the African American community and is currently still being experienced, and the ways in which those acts of violence have implications for the economic, political, social, and health inequalities that exist in the United States today. Before we start the panel, I do want to mention that we focus in this project specifically on legacies of racial violence against the African American community. But that's in no way to minimize the impacts of violence and other structural injustices among other communities in the United States. As we've been conducting some of our research, it's been kind of a consistent tension to think about other minoritized communities in the United States and how they can be better incorporated or included into some of our discussions. So you will notice that the research that we present today is focused on one particular minoritized community, but that in no way diminishes the impact of structural inequalities on other communities in the U.S. We have a number of other people who have joined us today that are part of this project. Adrian Aureliano was the moderator for our first panel. He's at the London School of Economics and here at PRIO and does work for our project on the lasting impacts of structural violence and the legacies of racial violence in the U.S. on particularly educational and economic outcomes. Yara Asai is joining us from the University of Central Florida. Her work is on health outcomes and the long-term negative repercussions of health inequalities. Helga Malling-Spillingsbo is here, and she has led up a lot of the work that we're going to present today when it comes to kind of contemporary efforts around redress. She does a lot of work with the TRC in Norway at the moment. And then Christian Davenport has been unable to join us, but he's with the University of Michigan, and he is working on compiling an anti-Black index in the United States for this project that looks at multiple forms of violence and marginalization against the Black community. So without further ado, I wanted to start our second panel for today, which focuses very specifically on the ways in which some of the lessons learned from Norway and other parts of the world can be brought to addressing or mitigating the long-term impacts of racial violence. So as Adrian correctly kind of set out in our first panel, we start with a prior in this project that past experiences are not in fact in the past, but rather they have quantifiable and long-lasting impacts on contemporary political and social outcomes. But what we're particularly interested in this second panel is efforts that can be made to redress some of those long-term impacts. So mitigate their effects, or in many ways kind of I don't want to use the term solve the problem, but assist in addressing some of the consequences. When we think about that from a global perspective, we often think about the concept of transitional justice. So transitional justice is the process and mechanisms that are put in place to address legacies of large-scale past conflict, human rights violations, and abuses. When we think about these institutions, we think about things like prosecutions, truth commissions, the potential for reparations legislation, educational curriculum reform, often the creation of memorials or museums. And the goals of these processes are kind of lofty, thinking about things like accountability, justice, and long-term social reconciliation. So one of the priors that we took in this project was to think about whether or not these global mechanisms of transitional justice could be applied to the U.S. context, whether or not we could turn the lens of a very robust global tradition of redress to the U.S. case. I want to start by saying that there have been both effective and aborted transitional justice attempts in the United States. To start off with, there's been a long tradition of political thought around issues of redress. We talked about W.E.B. Du Bois in the first panel. But he led one of the earliest calls about the need for both historical truth-telling and structural reform around the issue of slavery. The Black Panthers in their 10-point program specifically called for the need for reparations, a federal payment to the descendants of slaves. And the Republic of New Africa, which is a secessionist movement that launched around the time of the Panthers, asserted in their secessionist claim, a right to damages from the U.S. state. There have been a number of institutions that have actually been set up to address some of these long-term implications, and those have mostly been community-based in the United States. So the closest thing to truth commissions or investigative commissions have come out of places like Rosewood, Florida, Greensboro, North Carolina, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. These have been institutions or investigative commissions that have been set up to not address long-term legacies across society, but rather specific events. So, for example, the Rosewood Commission was put in place to address a racial riot that destroyed many of the homes and businesses of the Black community in that town in Florida. And the commission, on a community level, actually awarded payments to the survivors of that particular race riot, as well as established a descendant fund to give payments to people whose families had lost property or businesses during that riot. More recently, since the Black Lives Matter movement, Evanston, Illinois has established a government-funded reparations program to address Black historical injustices. This is actually being paid from tax revenue from a new cannabis tax that was launched in Illinois. And then there have been some larger, more national proposals. So there's a U.S. Conjoint Senate resolution to establish a commission on truth, racial hearing, and transformation. This is probably the largest and most robust effort that's been put forward. It hasn't left the Senate, but has been actively debated and sponsored by a number of senators. And this is a call for setting up what would look closest to a national level truth commission, though obviously it has not gotten the votes it's needed to move forward. So as part of the project, we've been thinking a lot as a team about how to conceptualize what a redress or a transitional justice process would look like in the U.S. context. And Helga and I recently completed a survey of the U.S. population in which we started to think about the ways in which the people's experiences with violence and structural injustice in the United States impacted their attitudes towards the type of process that they would want to see or the types of issues that they would want addressed. So let me start by just talking about the experiences of racial violence in the United States. This speaks very much to what we were talking about in the beginning of the first panel, which is the sheer amount of violence and discrimination experienced by the Black population. So if we ask a simple question about whether or not you were stopped by the police in the last 4 years, 21% of the Black sample that we spoke with had been stopped by the police compared to 14% of white Americans. And this can be anything from a routine car stop to something more substantial. 23% of the Black Americans in our sample had spent time in jail. This is a staggering fact and one that is worth pausing on for just a moment. So a quarter of the Black population that we talked to in our sample had actually been imprisoned for some length of time. And then probably most shockingly, or most a discrepancy that's most noticeable is that 70% of the Black respondents in our sample identified being discriminated against based on race at some point in their life, versus only 15% of white Americans. And most importantly, while people have these experiences, we also have some evidence that people believe that those experiences and the experiences of their families are impacting them in the current day. This is a little bit different than the research that Adrian's done, because Adrian has educational indicators of whether or not people were able to attain the same level of education. But this is people's perceptions, right? So how people believe that the discrimination that they've experienced is impacting them. So whereas about 20% of white people say that discrimination hasn't impacted their life at all, we have much larger numbers, over 40%. 40% of white people say that that discrimination has not impacted their life at all. That number's only 20% for Black Americans. And about 20% of Black Americans say that they believe it's impacted them a lot, right? So the discrimination is, even historical discrimination, is impacting them to the current day. If we take these experiences, we can start to think about the ways in which they translate into political preferences or policy preferences for redress of some sort. When we talk about truth commissions, one of the fundamental tenets of a truth commission is that learning about the past is important for moving forward into the future. But we can see that is a really racially divided attitude in the United States. So whereas two-thirds, right, about actually close to 75% of our Black sample believes that learning about the past and revealing truths about the past experience of racial violence is important, less than half of the white sample believed in that statement, right? So less than half of the white sample believed that it was important to talk about the past or reveal new truths about the past in order to move forward in the U.S. We also then ask questions about very specific policies. So reparations, as you could see from the historical slide that I put up earlier, has been a mainstream kind of policy recommendation among the civil rights movement and Black Power movements, this call for monetary the payment of monetary damages. 83% of Black Americans support this policy, where only 32% of white Americans thought that the idea of reparations to either descendants of slaves or people who had experienced violence was a good policy. In terms of learning new research or commissioning new research, and this could be as simple as just historical kind of investigations or something like a truth commission, 86% of Black Americans thought that new information was important, whereas only 62% of white Americans thought that was a good idea. the difference, of course, between commissioning new research and reparations is that one is a much lower bar, right? Gaining new information is relatively easy. Actually paying people money could have some material disadvantage to you personally. But then we also saw the same distinction when it came to acknowledgement and apology on the part of the U.S. government, right? So whether or not there should be some sort of formal recognition. We've seen this in other places. In Canada, for example, there was an apology on the part of the Canadian government for the residential school program against Indigenous Canadians. And the Canadian state actually made a formal apology. So when asked about that, about 62% of Black Americans thought that was a worthwhile idea, whereas 45% of white Americans supported that. The drop-off in Black American support for that policy is probably reflected on the idea that it doesn't actually have much material or tangible impact, right? It's just an apology. So we're still looking at the results of these surveys, and one of the things we're going to do going forward is to take the information about policy preferences and compare that to what people have actually experienced. We had an interesting conversation in our first panel about the stories that we tell each other. And so I just want to preview that one of the cool things we've done in this story, in this survey, is actually ask about the stories that people were told when they were younger and whether or not their families told them about histories of past discrimination, participation in the civil rights movement, experience with different types of discrimination. And we ask whether people were hearing those stories from their parents or their grandparents' generations. And so we'll be able to think about the types of information people received, what sources they received that information from, and then how that's impacting their current views about the types of redress efforts that they would like to see. All right, so without further ado, I want to turn it over to our panel. We have two distinguished and illustrious speakers here today to help us think about the context of redress and mitigation for past harms in Norway. I think that if I previewed anything from our historical slide, it's that the U.S. has talked about some of these efforts pretty extensively, but there hasn't been much actual work done in terms of institutional development. There's been some proposals, but we've seen no national level process. It's all been very fragmented. There's been some state level efforts, but really nothing beyond that. So Ellen Skar is here today. She's a research professor from CMI in Bergen. She's a political scientist who has worked on issues of transitional justice and reconciliation since the early 1990s. Her geographical focus is mostly on Latin America and Africa, but most recently she's been conducting research on the Norwegian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it's one of the things I hope she shares a lot of that experience with us today. Alexa Doving is a research professor at the Norwegian Center of Holocaust and Religious Minorities. Her field of research for the past few years has been on anti-Muslim racism and anti-Semitism here in Norway. And she was a curator of the temporary exhibit I Visible. Is that?
Invisible.
So it's invisible with a slash.
Invisible.
Invisible.
Very smart.
Everyday racism in Norway. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our panel. We're going to have a conversation, so we're all going to sit up here together to talk a little bit about these ideas. So Eileen, will you please start us off?
Thank you, Sayan. I'd like to start with telling you about my first meeting with the Norwegian Truth Commission. That was in the newspaper in 2019. And I read an article about a Truth Commission in Norway, and I thought, what? A Truth Commission in my country? This must be wrong. And I started looking into this, and it turned out there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission set down the previous year by the government to investigate assimilation policies directed against the indigenous Sami people in Norway and 3 minority groups, the Norwegian Finns or Kvenes and the Forest Finns. And I started off thinking, what's the point of this? I'd been working on truth commissions for quite a while in Latin America, but also in Africa. And to me, a truth commission was something that happened after a transition to either democracy or peace, after long periods of systematic human rights violations. And at the time, there were about somewhere between 70 and 100 such commissions worldwide. And I was just really, really curious as to why there was a Truth Commission in Norway. And I discovered that I actually knew very little about my own history. I didn't know at the time, and this is only, 5-6 years ago, that my own country was a colonial power founded on colonialism, expropriation, forced assimilation. And to me, that was quite an eye-opener. This was nothing I had learned about while I was in school, and it turns out very few people actually know their own history. I mean, the US was founded on, taking territory from indigenous people. So was Norway. So, having discovered that there was a Truth Commission operated, we started a research project with funding from the Norwegian Research Council to follow the process of the Norwegian Truth Commission in Norway during its operations. The commission, okay, let me just first say what a Truth Commission is maybe. So a Truth Commission is a body it's a temporary body. It's set down to investigate human rights violations, a pattern of human rights violations, not just specific incidents of violations. It has a dialogue or engagement with victims of human rights violations. It comes up with a written report with recommendations to the state, and it's endorsed by the state. So the Norwegian Truth Commission, which has a really long and complicated name in Norwegian, for short, it's called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So its mandate was to investigate historical repression, as I mentioned, which started roughly in the 1850s. It kept on going as a formal Norwegian policy until the 1950s. And the commission was to look also into the repercussions of assimilation policies all the way up to the present, and make recommendations to the Norwegian state for how to redress these harms. Okay, so this was a commission. It had 11 commissioners. It was headed by a Norwegian former politician, head of the Christian Democratic Party, Dagfinn Høybråten. And the commission consisted of 11 people who were there for their academic research and credentials, but there was also an element of representation in the commission, although they negated this. There were Sami people on the commission, and there was one Kven person on the commission. And it was a mix of historians. There was a former priest on the commission, a former bishop, and people working on the Sami languages, the Kven language, etc. What did they do? Throughout their operations, COVID started. Let me just say that. COVID started in 2020. So this commission was tasked with documenting a really, really long history of repression. Should I just say something about who the Sami and the Kven are, maybe? Do you know the Sami people? It's actually the only indigenous people in Europe. And they live across 4 countries. It's a cross-border minority who historically live in the north of Norway, the north of Sweden, the north of Finland, and the Kola Peninsula in Russia. And a lot of people, myself included in the past, think of the Sami as one people. There are many peoples. They have about 9 different languages. Some of those languages are now extinct. The main language, which is still a very much an alive language today, is spoken by the Northern Sami, who inhabit Finnmark and Troms in the north, and they are reindeer people. They're reindeer herders, nomadic people historically. And I think a lot of what is thought of stereotypically as Sami is actually associated with reindeer farming. But there are also South Sami, fishermen, and people who have done farming. The Kven are also cross-border people, originating from Finland, who came into Sweden and then into Norway. And then the Forest Finns are a very small group of people who came from Sweden and who live in this, the southeast of Norway. They have completely lost their language, so there is no such thing as a Forest Finn language today. So what was the commonality? The commonality was that the Norwegian state wanted these people to become good Norwegians. They wanted to assimilate them into Norwegian culture and especially Norwegian religion. So Sami, particularly Sami religion was considered pagan. So was their traditional music, the joik, and then started a long period of forceful assimilation. It's kind of similar to what happened in Canada with residential schools, where they sent kids off to residential schools at the age of 7, 8. They were not allowed to speak the language. They were not allowed to practice their culture. They saw their parents seldom. And the motivation by the Norwegian state was that, you know, these poor people living far up north, they don't have education, they don't have proper housing, hygiene is horrible, diseases are widespread, we have to civilize these people. And this rhetoric is very similar to what colonial powers have done in African countries, in Latin American countries, in Asian countries. This also happened in Norway. Not with the same kind of physical violence that we've seen in many other countries, but there was at least cultural and linguistic repression that went on for over 100 years. So the Commission has documented this in great detail. It didn't only affect the Sami, but also the Kven. And the consequences of this period of assimilation is that a lot of people have actually lost their language. They have lost their culture. They have lost their names. There was a rule way back in the 1800s that if you wanted to own land, you had to have a Norwegian name, which means that people dropped their Sami name or their Kven names, and they took on the Norwegian name, very often a Sen name, Olsen, Josefsen, Aniassen, etc., etc. So a lot of the names are also done, are gone. So what happened? You know, speaking of stories that are passed on to the next generation, a lot of the second and third generation grew up without the Sami language or the Kven language, and that's where the nation is at the moment. All this history was documented in a 700-page report where about 700 people gave their personal testimonies to the Commission. They traveled around the country holding open public meetings. Because this was during COVID, there were also a lot of online meetings. So people could give testimonies either in person or in writing or in video recordings. And the Commission gathered all this information, and they've written a really thorough historical analysis, documenting also the long-term negative consequences on the groups in question. So some of the obvious long-term negative consequences are the loss of language, the loss of culture, shame connected with being a Sami or being a Kven. There are, other investigations that have documented poorer health among the Sami, particularly, higher suicide rates, higher alcoholism rates, etc. So there are a lot of negative long-term consequences that the state now has to repair somehow. The report was handed over by this commission to the Norwegian Parliament on the 1st of June 2023, so that's 2.5 years ago. So the government and a lot of interest organizations are now in the process of implementing some of the recommendations from this Truth Commission. And the Truth Commission gave the recommendations in 5 different pillars. And let me just consult my notes so I don't forget any. So the first pillar was to strengthen culture and language. The first one was to make the knowledge about the assimilation policy known to the wider population. So dissemination regarding the policy of Norwegianization policy. And this literally means to make the majority of this country more aware of their historical past. Because I think one of the things that we found out when the Truth Commission was operating was the extremely high level of ignorance among the Norwegian population about the Sami, even higher about the Kven, and hardly anybody had even heard about the forest Finns. So this is it's a process of educating the Norwegian population. The second pillar of the recommendations had to do with language, which was to make Sami language a priority from kindergarten all the way to university level. So basically, taking the language back, learning the language. As I just mentioned, a lot of people have lost the language. So there is now a revitalization process underway. The third was culture, to increase the focus on Sami culture. And this also includes cross-border cooperation with Sami in Sweden and in Finland. The fourth pillar was conflict prevention measures, so work against hatred and discrimination. And I guess this is how this panel, or this topic, fits into the larger panel. And the fifth pillar was implementation of existing laws, because it does turn out that there has been legislation on Sami rights and Sami issues in the past, but a lot of these laws, for example, the law on prior consultation, has not been upheld or respected by the Norwegian state. So there is also a claim that the Norwegian state should respect its own laws, it should respect the international conventions that the Norwegian state has signed to protect indigenous people and minorities in Norway. So maybe I'll stop there, and then you can ask questions.
Sounds perfect. Thanks. Alex, I wanted to turn over to you to speak a little bit about the work you've been doing.
Yeah. I can start by just making it clear that I haven't done any research that focuses specifically on the impact of the past when it comes to experiences with racism. But I have reflected a lot on it, because what I mostly do in my research is to conduct interview studies with different minority groups. And when they tell about their experiences, it is really very evident how much history works as a framework for how they understand their experiences and how they describe their feelings connected to their experiences. So what I thought I will just bring into the panel is some examples from the interviews I've conducted. So then I will just, quote a little bit. The first one is from an interview I did with a woman with dark skin, always lived in Norway, and we ended up discussing why racist expressions had a much stronger effect on her than other forms of hate speech. She just told me that when she was out on the town last night, someone had screamed fucking whore after her, and she said, that was nothing. So, but she said, when insults are about my skin color, it is as if the person is simultaneously agreeing with the historical oppression of black people. If someone shouts jävla svarting or some other slur, it is as if they're also saying I should have been a slave. Another example is from an interview with a boy from Sápmi who said he had never been subjected to direct racism, but he told a lot of stories of being together with friends and different jokes about the Sami came up. He said, for example, the other day I was late for school and my friend asked if the reindeer had been hard to control. Although my informant really said he knew that his friend did not look down on him, the joke nevertheless became a painful start to the day. And he says, because I felt at that moment like I was an extension of the time when my grandparents were seen as primitive and stupid. And in our conversation, he further said that you really had to have knowledge about the oppression by the Norwegian state to understand that these kinds of joke, an innocent joke, can just, work straight into and be a sort of continuum of that oppression. Right now, I'm conducting interviews in a highly politicized situation. I'm conducting interviews with Jews in Norway, and we know that anti-Semitism is on the rise, and this is about triggered by Israeli warfare, but this is about the interviews is about their experiences with having a Jewish identity, and in my interview guide, I put in a question about. I sort of wanted to ask, to what degree do you think that your knowledge about what happened to the Norwegian Jews during the Second World War when they were deported, or even your awareness of everything that has to do with Holocaust, to what degree does it color your experiences today? And I was very afraid of asking this question because I thought they would think that I am saying, what you tell me is not real, what you tell me is just that I'm paranoia because of history. But I didn't, in most interviews, I don't even get to that question because it's raised, the issue of history is raised right in the beginning almost of the interviews. So I'll just give you some short quotes from that. A young woman said, "I'm so glad my great-grandma is not alive now. She would have been scared to see swastikas on the brick wall. I get scared myself. I know what it has meant." A woman around 40 says, "I don't think the new hatred has much to do with the Holocaust because it's, you know, it's new, but it does have the same mechanisms during, or at least before the World War II, where there was a need to blame someone. Then the Jews were the scapegoats for everything, and I think the same mechanism is at work now." A man said, "Some of us," referring to Jews, says that the history of Holocaust enables us to interpret the signs. We know when we have to be careful. It makes us more resilient. But other friends of mine also say that it makes us more afraid than we really should be. And when it comes to me, I'm probably more afraid than I need to be, or what's realistic." A last one is, "On the back of my grandparents' tombstones are the names of all those in the family who were deported and whose whereabouts are unknown. Of course, it's part of my context. Of course, it's part of what I say that I have, For example, when I remove people from my friends list on social media, that is because of self-defense." So these are just, examples to show. I think the examples really shows that a history of oppression, whatever that history is much more part of a minority consciousness, or to those who experience racism, that it really is a source for those who express themselves in racist manners. It's not a balance there. So shall I stop there, really? Are we ready to start? I had some sort of... I wanted to also really point to that, since this is mostly about the US, what Black Lives Matter movement has meant, I think, at least for some more awareness amongst the majority population about how they read people of color in Norway, or Black people in Norway. But we can discuss that later. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to start because both of you have worked with different minority communities in Norway. And I wanted to kind of ask the question of whether or not, of what do you think is influencing the different experiences or different trajectories of those minority groups? So kind of the factors or the conditions that are leading to those differences. So do you see, for example, anti-Semitism in Norway being different than anti-Sami, for example, minoritization?
Yeah, I mean, minority groups have been treated differently throughout history, and they have been represented in very various ways throughout Norwegian history. So there are different kinds of prejudices, and this, of course, makes the experience of racism today, or exclusion or discrimination or whatever you call it, also different among different minority groups. And indeed, interviews that we collected when we made an exhibition for young people, we gathered almost 70 interviews with quite young people from different minority groups, and there were some very clear differences, like Sami people talked about, being made fun of. Also some violent experiences with violence. People with dark skin talked about really being met with colonial stereotypes and that sort of things. Muslims, a lot about being faced with very certain prejudice related to Islam or to violence, and also not being, all of them talked about not being in the category of Norwegians. That was a common. But I think it was much more surprising how similar they described their experiences. I've already mentioned the use of history in how they talked about their experiences, but also, you know, we asked, why do you think you had to experience this? Or what makes you vulnerable to racism? And they all answered, my visibility. It could be my name, it could be someone knows about my belonging to a minority group, my clothes, my skin colors. And at the same time, very many described also being invisible. This is why we chose the title of the exhibition. And to be made invisible as an individual because they were, you know, representing a group. The stereotypes they were met with was about representing the group. So even if the prejudices or stereotypes differs a bit, the experience of what really happens is very similar, I find, in my material. Yeah.
And then did you want to jump in on that point?
Yeah, maybe I should just say that when we talk about minority groups, there are different kinds of statuses of minority groups in Norway.
That's true.
We have the indigenous people, the Sami, and then we have 5 national minority groups who are protected by special laws. So the Kven/Norwegian Finns, the Forest Finns, the Jews, the Romani, and the Roma people. And I just, yesterday when I was stuck on the train, I started reading a report from the Norwegian Human Rights Institute on racism. I think the report came out 2 years ago. They had conducted a lot of interviews in 2021, and they tried to capture racism directed against, or hate speech primarily. It turned out that the main expression of racism in this particular report was hate speech. Yeah. And a lot of it happens on social media. And they were trying to capture the differences in people's attitudes towards these specified 5 national minority groups. So they were not talking about, you know, recent immigrants or Muslims or Pakistani or, you know, or the Somali or large minority groups. They were talking about these historic minority groups. And it turned out that the 2 groups that definitely experienced the most racism were the Roma and the Romani. Hardly anybody had heard about the Forest Finns. They didn't experience, you know, they don't stand out physically, not religiously. There are no sort of markers in a way. So they are invisible in so many different ways. But the Romani and the Roma had a lot of stereotypes connected to them. You know, they stole, they were, you know, you couldn't trust them. They, you know, all kinds of stereotypes. And it was quite striking, actually, the differences in the level of racism experienced. And the Sami, I think it was about 7%. So it was quite low. And they also asked people things like, you know, the majority population, like 25,000 interviews across Norway, things like, would you like to have such and such as your neighbor? Or would you like to have such and such as part of your family? And then they asked people to rate their feelings on a scale from, I would hate that, to I would love that, or I don't care, kind of. And again, most of the racism was directed against the Romani and the Roma. So I do think that although racism can be experienced individually in the same way, there are also some major differences.
Especially in the attitudes of the majority.
Exactly.
Because we measured the same, but we got also a bit of criticism for asking about, like, who do you want as a neighbor, and the Roma people came on the bottom. That many of the respondents were thinking about the Romani people coming to Norway and not really even knowing we had a national minority of how many Romas are there in Norway? I mean, it's like 2,000 or something, 1,500.
It's a small group.
It's a very, very small group.
Yeah.
And the stereotypes connected to them are, of course, historically based and connected to it. Yeah. But anyway, it's also very difficult to measure that kind of attitudes. But attitudes differ a lot. I mean, we measure prejudices against Muslims and prejudices against Jews, and like this. differences. I mean, but the feeling, the experience, how they talk about it is really very similar. I find it very similar in our material. Yeah.
And then I was struck by your opening comment about how little people know about their history. It was one of the themes that I think came up in the first panel as well, particularly talking about some of those high school students from the South who weren't even aware of the kind of civil rights experiences that their parents had experienced, either the discrimination or their participation in different types of activism. And I know that one of the recommendations from the Norwegian Truth Commission is kind of building up these educational programs. Kind of where is that recommendation going, and do you think it'll be successful? Or are there other ways that we can learn about history and kind of influence the discussion of history that isn't being done?
You know, I think the idea is that they want to establish a national center in Norway to preserve the memory and the culture of the Sami Kven, the Norwegian Finns, and the Forest Finns. This hasn't materialized yet. There are discussions of how to integrate education about the assimilation policies and the history into Norwegian curricula. But it's, you know, we went to a seminar last week, actually, Helga and I and a lot of other people, where the theme was reconciliation and education, and what kind of responsibility, especially the universities in Norway have, of integrating knowledge about the Sami in particular, but also about the Kven, in the curricula. You know, how do you integrate knowledge when you educate nurses, when you educate teachers, when you educate the police, when you educate, you know, all the professions who are in contact with indigenous people or minority groups, and they're quite ignorant, most of them, the loud majority, are quite ignorant about the history. So there are talks about how to sensitize people more, you know, educate them, and by doing so, making them more sensitive to some of the issues that people of minority actually do experience in their day-to-day life still today. As far as I know, there is no national policy on this at the moment. And let me just say one thing. The Norwegian Truth Commission, I think, deliberately left these 5 pillars of recommendations very loose. You know, if you compare the recommendations to recommendations in other truth commissions, like we've examined all the truth commissions in Latin America, and some of them have very concrete recommendations. They say, do this, so-and-so is responsible for doing this, this is the time frame. The Norwegian state said, ooh, these are the 5 pillars we need to do something in. And then they sent the document back again to the Sami Parliament, the Sami National Parliament, for a round of hearing. So the Sami Parliament consulted with Sami interest organizations, some of the Kven organizations were involved to give concrete feedback to the Norwegian government on what kind of measures the Norwegian state should put in place. And I don't know what the status of that is at the moment, because our research on following the process of the Truth Commission finished in 2023 after the Commission had handed in its report. But my impression is that there isn't really a national strategy at the moment, but there are lots of different initiatives at different universities, among in schools, you know, educating teachers, for example, in kindergarten, in bringing out information about the Sami to high school students. So there are lots of initiatives, but it isn't really a coordinated whole as far as I can see at the moment. But education, I think, is one of the big areas where the state wants to do something. And, you know, an indicator of this might be the funds in the Research Council allocated to research on Sami issues. There is a special program in the Research Council. And last year, only 2 projects were funded. They were both on the Sami language. This year, about half of the projects that were funded were on education and language. So I think this really is a big satsing, as we say in Norwegian, you know, a big effort is going to go into this field. Also because there is a very tight connection between language revival and cultural revival. And with that also a proudness of ethnic proudness, you know, who you are, where you come from, where your identity lies.
And I think this issue of education is both important and threatening, right? So we see this in the U.S. context with the way in which the current administration is going after things like woke politics or educational curriculum that is seen to be promoting the study of racial injustices and structural inequalities and things like that. So these kind of deliberate attacks. But I may be a little bit more skeptical. I've been hearing more critiques coming out of the Canadian example about curriculum reform. So their Truth Commission ended a few years earlier than the Norwegian Commission, and there has been more deliberate attempts to address curricular issues in Canadian schools, particularly lower levels, elementary and middle school. And so some of the new survey research suggests that younger Canadians are learning about kind of Indigenous pasts and particularly the residential school system. But there seems to be a sense among the activists that I've talked to that it kind of checked a box and now it's done. Right. So now that this educational reform has been done, a lot of the other larger kind of structural programs around things like reparations or property restoration and land restoration haven't been as prioritized. And so it was just kind of an interesting counterexample that the Canadian experience, it tends to be more critical of that. But Alex, I wondered if you wanted to weigh in on this issue of kind of education or some of the work that you do, which is really focused on bringing this knowledge to a broader population.
Yeah, at the center,
yes.
we do have, take school children in and learn them about specifically the history of Holocaust and Holocaust in Norway, but also in it. But it was actually a big ethical discussion when we made the Everyday Racism exhibition. To what extent shall we show that, my favorite book as a child was Baba on Honeymoon, and full of racist pictures. Shall we sort of show it to kids who doesn't really see those kinds of pictures in children books anymore, to explain sort of why stereotypes are still alive, or should we not? And we had a reference group with different people having been active in Norwegian, African society, etc. And it was very split what they thought was right to do. To show not big pictures, small pictures, to explain the stereotypes, how widespread they have been also in Norwegian popular culture. Everything from pictures on spices and, So we chose to show them, and it works quite well, but it also is like young people standing in front of a picture and laughing and saying, this is you with those big eyes and blah, blah, So we have to adjust all the time. But when it comes to education, I just wanted to say something, because we lived in Berkeley in 2015. Very active year for Black Lives Matter. But anyway, my daughter was the only white person who wanted to go to a class. It was called Afro-American Psychology. They had this on the high school. And they read, and the idea was that, this subject should also contribute to tell the story of oppression, but also to make some sort of, be proud of your race, etc. And the main thing they read was it was a PhD, it's good. Maybe you know it, it's called Why Do the Black Kids Sit Together at the Cafeteria or something. And the answer is that only black kids can share their experiences as blacks and come to terms and find a way to be strong together. And, my daughter really struggled with that. And I've been thinking a lot about it, because what is it when you teach history about oppression? And really, it's a history so much more for the majority, but for the whole. And it's really important to sort of keep it like a common box of knowledge, not to listen. Yeah, you know what I mean. So I was a bit also, critical to that subject at school, because, it's sort of segregated the history into a minority history that is really not a minority history as such. Yeah.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I don't know if I answered.
This discussion of I like the understanding of this kind of ethical discussion about which images you show and which images you don't show, because I think you're right. You're introducing the images back into popular culture in a way that they didn't need to be, but at the same time, people's parents grew up, kids' parents grew up looking at the same things.
Yeah. When is the time to totally bury them at the graveyard of history and where shall we take them? But I think what you used the word sensitivity, I think, in some sentence. And I think that knowledge really can help to make the majority more sensitive towards how the past really lives on in the present, and especially when it comes to the experiences of racism. I think we have a long way to go with, it's a lot of talk about minority consciousness, but I think we need to, higher the level of having a majority consciousness, be aware of the privileges you have due to history. Yeah.
Can I just mention one thing? I mean, in terms of the responsibility of the majority, I mean, the Norwegian Truth Commission had two aims with the recommendations and the report. One was to facilitate reconciliation between the indigenous groups and the minority groups and the state, to sort of acknowledge what the state had done in terms of oppression. But the other one was facilitate reconciliation between the majority and the minority groups. And in order to do so, you have to have the majority on board, right? So there has to be some kind of a two-way process. And in that sense, I don't think the Norwegian Commission did a great job in bringing on the majority, because it was really it has been called the silent commission. It kind of worked really, really quietly, and it involved and invited the indigenous groups and the minority groups to participate actively, but the majority wasn't really included in that process. So, for long-term reconciliation, you have to have the majority on board as well.
Yeah. And I'm really interested in this this idea of bringing in the majority when thinking about it in the U.S. context, because one of the things that we've seen in the U.S. is how threatening that conversation is, right? Because of the entrenched nature of economic segregation and the kind of real threat to kind of white power, or what we talked about as liberal whiteness in the first panel. But the lack of overt physical violence in the Norwegian case kind of changes that a little bit. And I was wondering how you kind of see those two things. So is it an apples and oranges case? Can we not compare the U.S. case to the Norwegian case when it comes to the ability of the Norwegian majority to have those reconciliation conversations? Or do you find them equally, or do you suspect they will be equally problematic, right? Equally challenging?
Oh, that's a tough question. But in a way, I'm thinking that the parallels would be how the U.S. has treated its indigenous people. Yeah. Originally taking the land, slaughtering, the oppression of the people who lived there. That is a parallel to how Norwegians have been treating the indigenous population. So, but I guess the U.S. has had waves of minorities who are not really minorities, they're just a large part of the population, which is quite different. So, you can argue, or white people can argue, that their positions of power and prestige and privilege are threatened. I mean, the Norwegian majority cannot argue that, because the numbers of indigenous people, it's tiny. The minorities are tiny. I mean, they don't present any threat economically or wealth-wise or political-wise at all. So the question here is, how can you bring people into positions of power? How can you bring people into, positions of privilege rather than the other way around? So I think the discussions are different. What would you say?
I think, obviously different, also because of history and everything. And your example but when it comes to, let's say, writing in the newspaper about racism before Black Lives Matter came to Norway, you always was answered, but do we really have racism in Norway? What does the concept mean? All those kinds of discussions. If I write something today or after Black Lives Matter, you could get a discussion or a debate, but never it was never asked if racism really existed in our society. So I think we need those big sort of common debates and happenings to sort of realize something. And I think the majority, just see what's happened in school. Racism has now been almost, it's not a separate subject, but they have teaching, training courses for about the subject, etc., etc. So something has happened, and I think what's happened then is a bit, maybe you can compare it with something in the US. I don't really know, but at least something has happened, I think, in the majority's consciousness about that the world is not experienced exactly the same if you are white or black.
So when we think about that consciousness raising or consciousness awareness, or even this concept of reconciliation, what is the end goal, right? So what is the thing to work towards?
I would say it's very, very simple. Equal rights.
Yeah.
Equal rights, equal treatment, equal respect. I mean, when you can start looking beyond the color or the religion or the sexual orientation of a person and just see the person, then I think you've reached your goal.
Well, it's hard to not agree with that.
No, but it sounds
Yeah.
very simple, but
It sounds
is,
very
but
simple.
it is very difficult.
But I think on the way to reach that goal, you have to acknowledge that differences or that people are racialized. I mean, you have to deal with it. And then you have to say, okay, the goal is this, but we're not there. And one has to, ask why, and try to understand, and, just be aware. So, yeah.
Can I just mention again this report that I half read yesterday about discrimination in Norway? 20% of the reported, 18% to be very exact, of the reported hate speech incidents that were reported to Norwegian authorities were not racism in the classical sense, but homophobia. It was, I don't know if you would call it racism or something else, but it was against sexual minorities. That was like 20% of the total. So it just says that, discriminating against people can be done on many different grounds, and race is one of them. But there are also there are also other ways of stigmatizing or mistreating or degrading people. And the solutions, I guess, are pretty much the same. It's respect the person for who the person is.
Yeah.
I wanted to come back to this question about including the majority in the conversation, because I don't know that I'm clear on what that looks like. So it's about education at some level, but what would a truth commission that included more majority voices look like? What would have yes, I mean, how would you have included those voices more in the process, or yeah.
That's another tough question. Personally, I try to travel around the country to be part of these public meetings. But I did experience that as a majority Norwegian, as an obvious outsider, I wasn't really welcome. I was told not to speak. I was told to sit in the back. I was told that this was not for me. So I think also from the minority perspective, it was perceived as a process, a reconciliation process, and a fact-finding and truth-finding process for the minorities. And I don't say all, but at least some people in that process felt that the majority should just be out there. So I think it's a two-way thing. And it's hard to sort of push yourself into a dialogue if the person you want to have a dialogue with doesn't want that dialogue. Yeah. So how to include the majority is also not easy, but I think education, at least be aware of this history, be aware of the fact that we have had oppressive laws in this country, be aware of the fact that we have actively discriminated against people and groups of people historically. I mean, we had a law against Jews in this country. Jews are not welcome by law. This is part of our history, and I think we should be aware. And another reason why I think we should be aware is that this reflects also on how we welcome and how we treat more recent migrants to Norway. Refugees, people who come to work here, people who marry into families. I mean, there are patterns of racism and patterns of disequal treatment that, goes back a long, long time. And I think without understanding that history, I think it's also hard to deal with current challenges in a multicultural society.
And your comment makes me think about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because a lot of the strongest findings from that commission were that the information that was revealed didn't really change attitudes or influence the Black or the colored population, but the largest shifts in attitude and information were in the white population, right? So the white population learned more about the experience of the past in South Africa. The Black population have lived it, right? So it was less useful. So even thinking about incorporating minority populations in the actual information gathering process as being so important for how those historical lessons are then translated going forward.
I suppose it just has to have a step 2 and a step 3 and include more and more people. But I also think the exercise of being aware has some effect, and as part of the majority consciousness concept, I think the concept of white privileges from the States. I think you can turn it into majority privileges. Just that I want my son to know that he inherits from us because I inherited it flat from my grandparents, from my parents, and this is not something refugees and immigrants in Norway has, and this is why it is so many economical differences, why Oslo is so segregated. It's not due to they having a specific mentality that's very different from yours. I want that to be part of his awareness. And I think that is also part of the whole thing of, yeah.
Well, folks, I think it's time to open up the floor to questions if anybody has them. Helga, would you mind grabbing the microphone? I have plenty of other questions for the panel, but I wanted to just see if the audience had anything they wanted to talk about.
Hello, thank you. So thank you for that presentation. I'm still learning a lot about these kinds of truth and reconciliation commissions. Is there data or information or evidence about when they take place after the harms have been done, decades later, or if they happen immediately after? Does the population take it differently if they were the population that was affected? Or, for example, in the United States, we're talking about intergenerational trauma. What do we know about how that works?
Do you want me to answer that?
Please.
Well, I think there are 3 groups of truth, what we call post-transitional commissions, which can happen 10 or 20 or 30 years after the repression has taken place, like in Brazil, for example. And then you have what Norway is an example of, which are commissions set down in non-transitional contexts to look into historic repression. And those are different because there is no regime change associated with those commissions. And normally the periods of violence that are investigated are, much, much longer, decades, maybe 100 years, maybe 150 years, or like in Mauritius, 250 years of colonialism. So these commissions have a much wider mandate in terms of time. And because there is no regime change, they are not investigating the crimes of the prior regime, which most truth commissions do, right? So these commissions have to get on board, different political factions and parties and minority groups and majority groups, which is different from if you've had political repression against, for example, left-wing politicians in a Latin American regime. Does that make sense? So you can have truth commissions at any time, but this group of truth commissions that Norway kind of represents is a very new group, and it doesn't count many commissions. You've had similar commissions in investigating harms against indigenous people in Australia, in Greenland, in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. But there may be many more. I think an example has been set now. So, if the US at any point of time wants to look into repression against national minorities, I think there are plenty of examples to draw from.
Which is one of the reasons that, particularly for this project, we find the Norwegian Commission so interesting and useful, because I think if we were to think about a commission in the U.S. case, it would look similar to this. But we have all of the same challenges from a U.S. context, which is the first, so I think you rightly raised which minority would be the subject of the investigation. But if it were to be a commission into the legacies of racial violence, there's also a question about the time period. So it's not clear to me that we have a distinct termination even of the violence that would be under investigation, right? So often when we think about truth commissions, the violence under question or the abuse has ended in some way, right? And then you can kind of look back at it. But depending on which form of violence against the Black population in the United States you would choose to investigate, that violence hasn't ended, right? And so, and I think it would be short-sighted to have a commission that just looked into the effects of chattel slavery, for example, right, without taking the broader context of violence into consideration. And then the question of transition, depending on how you would define that violence, is the question of whether or not the regime perpetrating that violence is still in power, right? And so I think, whether you think about it as a political party, whether you think about it as the security apparatus or structure in terms of the prison system and violence against Black Americans, it's not clear, right, what the scope of that process would be. We've had much more success in a U.S. context in these kind of one-off investigative commissions that don't necessarily deal with systemic patterns of violence, but kind of. And I don't. That's a little bit unfair, because I think some of the commissions, like Rosewood, for example, looked at the structures around racism in that community that then led to the riots that took place, right? So I think there's some of that, but they're very regionally isolated, right? So it's not, and nothing is on the federal level. And then there is the lynching commission that's currently going on in Maryland, and that's to investigate and gather information on every single lynching that took place in the state of Maryland. It's very much an information gathering process, which is attempting to document and maybe not going quite as far as it could in terms of kind of why that violence happened. But it's very difficult to do that on the state level without engaging with federal policies that allowed that violence to persist. So Norway is such a fascinating example to engage with from a U.S. perspective, but still raises so many questions.
No, I just wanted to add, but I don't know the story in details. Of course, I should. But I mean, the center I work in is actually also the result of such a process. It is the states, the economical liquidization of the Jewish community. All the properties that was taken by the Nazis, of course, but continued to be properties for the state. It was, sort of paid back in a long process of investigation, et cetera, just to remind that we also, and this is very unique, it hasn't happened in any other European country. Yeah.
So there was an attempt to quantify the kind of economic benefit that the state received, and then take that money and put that into other.
The Nazis were very good with lists. They made list of every little fork and cup and bed and everything and all the flats. So they actually made a specific sum based on all this and up to currency of the day and etc. It was a long process, and the parliament decided on it, and money was given to the Jewish congregation, but also to the center, and a few families also got something. But yes.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that there have been some economic reparations for Jews in Norway.
Yeah.
There has been a little bit of economic reparations for the Sami as well. There was a program, I think, way back in the 80s. And other forms of reparations has been, the king has apologized for the assimilation policy. The Sami parliament was a kind of political recognition of the Sami. And then the Truth Commission. So there have been different kinds of reparatory measures over the years. And also the ratification of the ILO 169 of indigenous people. So there are different policies across time in Norway also addressing the wrongs of the past. But I must add, there hasn't been political agreement on these policies. I mean, when the Truth Commission was established, the right-wing party and the Progressive Party, FRP, were against it. FRP still wants to abolish the Sami parliament. That's one of their policies. They think it's a bad idea to have a Sami parliament. They want Sami issues to be integrated in Norwegian politics. So these things can be also quite contentious at the national level, even in tiny little Norway.
Are there other questions from the audience?
Yeah, thank you for the great discussion. I was just curious. So a lot of, it's mentioned a couple of times now about reparations, but are there other forms of beyond reparations that are being discussed either here in Norway or in the United States that go beyond just a financial sort of compensation for past? Because there can be some danger in just focusing on reparations as the be all end all for the past injustices.
I mean, I can. Let me start by speaking to the U.S. context. I think it's one of the things that the kind of activist community around redress has been trying to push in the U.S., particularly since the Black Lives Matter movement. There was a lot of, I mean, I think in large part because of the way in which chattel slavery was tied to the economic mechanisms of the country, that much of the earliest push for redress was really focused on that, right? And also the emphasis on kind of wealth disparities across racial groups in the United States. I mean, so this is, I mean, again, as early back as W.E.B. Du Bois and Martin Luther King and the Panthers, there was this kind of very clear push for reparations. And then we talked about Ta-Nehisi Coates in the first panel, but he had a very popularized article in The Atlantic early on in the Obama administration, I believe, it was probably about 2016, in which he kind of made the case. And it was a very provocative article in which he talked about where the money would come from, how much money it would be. And there's economists who have estimated it's in the billions that would need to be paid back to Black communities if you kind of aggregate it from the funds that were earned during slavery kind of up. And there's been individual institutionalized efforts around that. So this is places like Georgetown that were built on, universities that were built on slave labor, attempting to kind of give back to descendants of slaves. But I think the reason that has been the focus is that it's in some ways, well, it's the hardest, it's the easiest thing to kind of wrap your head around is, you know, monetary payments can be conceptualized in some way. A lot of what was talked about in the beginning, in the first panel about kind of structural injustices, I mean, that's an argument to kind of destroy and rebuild, you know, the very conditions of American society in a way that I don't know that we have a good model for what that would look like. And also in large part because I think when we think about a lot of the commissions that have been done to support the rights or information around Indigenous communities, the Black population in the U.S. is just larger, right? And so it's larger, it's more ingrained, it's more politically active. In some ways, it is potentially more of a threat, right, to the minority group than some of the other minority communities. And so it's there have been proposals for truth commissions in the U.S. context, and that in many ways is a push for kind of fact finding and additional information. I don't want to delegitimize that call, because I do think that there's huge chunks of the American population that don't understand the pervasive roots of racial violence in the U.S., but it may not be the biggest issue, right? The biggest, curriculum reform or something like that may not be the biggest thing that needs to be addressed. But I do go back to, I think contemporary politics in the U.S. tells us what is currently threatening to the establishment, and that it certainly starts with education. We were talking about museum installations, right? The Smithsonian has had to remove already many references to violence against racial groups, to anti-Semitism and things like that. And so, you would imagine that an administration wouldn't bother with changing museum exhibits unless they believed it to be threatening, right, to the current political agenda.
Yeah. No, culture was super threatening. And that is why assimilation policies in so many countries have tried to take language and culture away from people. Because it is threatening. It's like when you assimilate, you try to make everybody equal, because if everybody is equal, you're not an external threat. Otherwise, you wouldn't.
Or at least everybody
and
looks the same, right?
Exactly.
Maybe not
So
equal,
these
but looks the
cultural
same.
expressions are super important. And to your question about reparations, it's not only monetary reparations. You have symbolic reparations. You have museums. You have art exhibitions. You have, being able to do the yoik in a church today is a way of reparation because it was forbidden in the past. So this sort of recognition of groups who have experienced racism or violations can take so many different forms. And economic compensation is just like one tiny little bit of it.
But it's interesting in the U.S. case that we haven't moved beyond that, right? So the dialogue is still very much focused on monetary payments.
But it's a very money-focused culture.
I take the critique.
But also a country where economic disparities are, so much larger than in most European countries or in most, any democracies anywhere in the world. The US must be at the tops in terms of economic disparities and the Gini index. So, yeah. So that also just tells a story about what kind of role money and wealth plays in that society.
I just wanted to mention to your question that also, in fact, the Roma people in Norway have had a sort of formal apology from Erna Solberg when she was the prime minister, based on a historical work. Actually, some researchers at our center did, documenting what happened to the Roma people living in Norway. They were sent out just before the Second World War because they were taken from their civil statsborgers, what do you call it, state statsborgerskap, and not given, because of laws for travelers, etc. So they were taken to concentration camps, the Norwegian Roma. And because of this historical documentation, it came a very formal apology from Erna Solberg, and they also gave some money to make the Romano Care cultural center that we have. I was thinking about that. But I just wanted to end with a positive thing, or that I always like to think about this popular culture and also culture, but also popular culture, that is really an arena where members of different minorities meet and express themselves. And I think that has meant a lot in Norway, from, these competitions, You Got Talent or something, where the Sami young, rock band became really very, very popular. And also now you have, and the book from, what's her name again? The Sameproblemet.
Sameproblemet. Yeah.
I mean, these things really means a lot, I think, for telling the story of the past in a very sort of, and the meaning it has in today's society. Culture is super important in these issues.
And then I wanted to ask you a question, the kind of why now question. So you mentioned the politics around different political parties not supporting the Truth Commission. So why was it that political moment that you think it was possible to start the commission? And
I think there are two answers. One is the international context, that there were already similar commissions established in, like I said, Greenland, Australia, and Canada. And the concrete thing that happened was that the leader of a minority Sami party, Laila Susanna Vars, she's a trained jurist. She traveled to Canada as part of her work for, I think, her PhD. And she met with Little Child, which was one of the Indigenous commissioners on the 3-person Canadian Truth Commission. She was really inspired by him. And she saw, from her own history, having grown up with residential schools, she saw the parallels to the setting in Canada, with the forced removal of Indigenous children from their parents to residential schools. She came back to Norway. she proposed a truth commission focusing on residential schools for the Sami in Norway. That was the start of it. The Sami parliament debated this. They didn't want it. Some people said, oh, we have to look to the future. We shouldn't look to the past. She consulted with the Council of Elders. They thought it was a good idea. So you had a process in the Sami parliament first. They brought it to the Norwegian parliament, the proposal for a truth commission. The Norwegian parliament turned it down. And then 2 left-wing politicians, the current head of the Socialist Party, Kirsti Bergstø, with the then head of the Socialist Party, Fylkesnes, they took the case back again, and they're both from the north. They pushed the issue. They started a dialogue with the Sami parliament, who started the dialogue with Sami interest organizations. The Kven were brought in, and then a new proposal came in from these 2 left-wing politicians. And with some mobilization, they actually pushed it through. So it was it took quite a long time, but it was directly inspired by this visit to the Canadian Truth Commission. So it just also tells a story about how important single individuals can be in terms of bringing around change. So if Laila Susanne Vars hadn't proposed it, maybe we wouldn't have had a Truth Commission.
It was single individuals, but also the international context.
Of course.
Right.
And the focus on indigenous rights international, I think, played a big role. And Norway was actually very central. The Sami were very central in bringing about that ILO resolution back in the 1990s. And I think we were the first country to ratify it internationally. So there has been a tradition or a history of involvement for indigenous rights.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Well, folks, with that, I want to thank you both so much for joining us. It's really been such an engaging conversation, and it was really intellectually inspiring to bring the conversation of from the U.S. to global context, particularly here in Norway. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for everybody that attended the panel.